Victor Halstead straightened his cufflinks and smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows the answer to every question in the room. He set his glass down on Horace's desk with a soft, deliberate click, and then he said it calm, as a man ordering breakfast. "Tell the Burroughs family they have 30 days. Then we take the land." Horace leaned back and said nothing. Outside, 3 children were playing in the yard of that same ranch, and neither man looked toward the window. Victor picked his glass back up. "And Adelaide," he added, almost as an afterthought, will smile at the founder's ball and say nothing. "She belongs to this family now. That's the arrangement." He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel in any dramatic way. He was simply certain. That certainty was the most dangerous thing in all of Red Willow. This kind of story moves you the kind, where a woman decides she is done being an arrangement, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because what Adelaide Pembroke does next will surprise every single person who ever underestimated a quiet woman in a beautiful dress. The train arrived 40 minutes late into Red Willow, which Adelaide Pembroke took as either a bad omen or the universe's last honest warning. She wasn't sure which. She sat very straight in her seat while the other passengers shuffled toward the doors, and she kept her gloved hands folded in her lap like they belonged to someone well-behaved, someone settled, someone who had not spent the last 6 hours of travel pressing her forehead against the window glass and watching the Wyoming landscape swallow every familiar thing she'd ever known. Her trunk was in the luggage car. Inside it, wrapped in tissue paper that her mother's housekeeper had folded with more tenderness than Adelaide's own mother had shown in the final days before departure, was a wedding dress. Ivory silk, with a 10-foot train and seed pearl buttons running down the back 31 of them, because Adelaide had counted twice during the fitting, while the seamstress told her how lucky she was. Lucky. Adelaide had smiled at the seamstress and said thank you and decided not to say what she was actually thinking, which was that she had never once been asked. Not when her father, Edmund Pembroke, had first mentioned Victor Halstead's name at the dinner table 9 months ago, with the satisfied expression of a man completing a business transaction. Not when he had described Victor as educated and financially sound and from excellent stock, as though Victor were a horse being evaluated at auction. Not when Adelaide had sat very quietly and waited for the question that never came, the simple question of whether this was something she wanted. It wasn't asked. Edmund Pembroke was a powerful man, and powerful men of his era did not ask. They decided. And what Edmund had decided was that his daughter's considerable education, her sharp mind, and her unfortunate habit of having opinions about things like banking regulation and labor wages were best directed toward supporting an ambitious young man's rise, rather than cluttering up the Pembroke household with inconvenient complications. Victor Halstead was that young man. Adelaide was the arrangement. She understood the mechanics of it. She was 24, which her mother had begun mentioning with increasing frequency, as though the number were a tide coming in. Victor was 28, handsome in a carefully maintained way, and the only son of Horace Halstead, who ran the single bank in Red Willow and 4 surrounding settlements. It was, by every measure her world recognized, an excellent match. Adelaide stepped off the train onto a wooden platform that smelled of sawdust and horse and something indefinably Western, a rawness to the air that no amount of proper upbringing had prepared her for, and she stood there for a moment with her traveling case in her hand, blinking in the afternoon light. Red Willow was smaller than she'd imagined. It had a main street of maybe 12 businesses, a church at one end, a bank at the other, and in between them the entire social architecture of a community that had decided what it was and who mattered. She could read a town like this. Her father had taken her to enough of them on business trips that she'd learned the grammar of them, which buildings had fresh paint and which had been left to weather, which horses at the hitching posts were well fed, and which were working too hard, who stood in doorways watching new arrivals, and who didn't bother to look up. She was being watched. She noted it without moving her head. Miss Pembroke. The voice was correct, warm but controlled, like a fireplace in a parlor where someone had specifically chosen how large the fire ought to be. Victor Halstead crossed the platform toward her, with 2 long strides, and the kind of smile that had clearly been practiced until it looked natural. He was exactly as handsome as his photograph, and his suit was exactly as well cut. and he took her hand with exactly the right amount of pressure, firm enough to be confident, gentle enough to be respectful. "You look tired from the journey," he said. "We'll get you settled at the Calvert house before supper. My father is eager to meet you." "It's good to finally meet you in person," Adelaide said. "The letters were formal, I know." He smiled again. "We'll have time to fix that." He said it pleasantly, which was the strange thing. He said it as though formality were a problem he would solve for her. "Your trunk will be brought up. Don't worry about any of the arrangements. Everything's been handled." Adelaide nodded and let him guide her toward a waiting buggy. She noticed he did not ask if she was hungry, or tired, or how the journey had been. He told her she looked tired, which was an observation, not an inquiry. It was a small thing. She filed it away with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that small things were usually the accurate ones. Horace Halstead was waiting at the hotel. He was a larger man than Adelaide had expected, not tall but solid, with the kind of physical certainty that came from decades of being the most important person in every room he entered. He shook her hand once, firmly, and looked at her the way a banker looks at collateral. "Edmund's daughter," he said. "You've got his eyes." "So I've been told," Adelaide said. "Smart man, your father." Horace nodded slowly. "Made some excellent decisions over the years. This being one of them. He meant her. He meant her engagement to his son." He said it without any apparent awareness that she was standing right there, a person who could hear the sentence being constructed around her. "I'll take that as a compliment," Adelaide said carefully. Horace smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Take it however you like, Miss Pembroke. You'll be family soon enough." That night, in a room that was perfectly clean and entirely unfamiliar, Adelaide lay on top of the hotel bedspread in her traveling clothes and stared at the ceiling and made herself breathe steadily. She wasn't panicking. She was cataloging. There was a difference. She cataloged Victor's smile and Horace's eyes, and the way neither man had once asked her a question whose answer they weren't already planning to manage. She told herself this was how it was done. She told herself her father was not a cruel man. She told herself that security was not nothing, that plenty of women had built reasonable lives inside arrangements exactly like this one, and that she was educated enough and sensible enough to find her place within it. She almost believed it. She was still lying there, fully dressed, when the clock in the downstairs lobby chimed midnight. The first week passed in a sequence of events that Adelaide recognized as a very thorough introduction to the life she was expected to lead. Victor took her to meet the Calvert family, who owned the general store, the Beaumont sisters, who ran the millinery, Dr. Ames and his wife, who were apparently the social center of whatever passed for Red Willow's cultivated class. Everyone was cordial. Everyone was curious. Everyone looked at Adelaide with the specific warmth reserved for a person who has been carefully selected, which is slightly different from the warmth reserved for a person who has simply arrived. She smiled through all of it. She asked appropriate questions. She wore appropriate clothes. She sat appropriately in parlors and ate appropriate portions at supper tables. And when Victor mentioned at the Beaumont sisters' tea that Adelaide had studied bookkeeping at her women's college, the silence that followed was brief but precise. "How unusual," said the elder Beaumont sister, in the tone of someone calling a thing unusual when they mean something else entirely. "It was a good education," Adelaide said. "Of course," Victor said immediately, smoothly, redirecting. "Adelaide is exceptionally well prepared for the responsibilities of managing a household of our scale." He smiled at her as he said it. The smile was charming. The sentence was a box, and he had put her inside it with his hand on her elbow and his face completely pleasant. Adelaide picked up her teacup and said nothing. She was getting very good at saying nothing. This concerned her more than she wanted to admit. It was on a Tuesday, the 10th day, that everything tilted. Adelaide had excused herself from an afternoon of fabric selection for the wedding, which Victor had arranged with a dressmaker whose opinion he had already formed. She'd told him she wanted air. He'd told her not to walk too far past the main street, which she'd registered as strange, since the main street was perfectly safe in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, but she'd agreed, and then walked precisely as far as she wanted. She ended up near the livery stable. There was a horse in the street. Not in a stall, not at a hitching post, but actually in the middle of the street, and it had apparently decided it was not going any further, which the dusty cowboy attached to its lead rope was discovering in real time. The horse was a medium-sized bay, gelding with an expression of serene, implacable stubbornness. Cowboy, tall, lean, with a hat so beaten down by weather it had given up trying to keep its shape, was crouched down to the animal's eye level, which Adelaide had never seen a person do before. He was talking. She couldn't hear what he was saying at this distance, but she could hear the tone conversational, unhurried, as though he and the horse were two men at a dinner table working through a disagreement. The horse blinked. The cowboy said something else. The horse took 3 steps to the left and walked directly into a water trough sitting at the edge of the street. Not through it, not over it. Into it, with intention. The water came up to its knees, which seemed to satisfy it completely, and it stood there looking at nothing in particular, while the cowboy straightened up and turned around, and he was absolutely soaked from the hat down. He saw Adelaide. She had a hand pressed over her mouth, because something had happened to her face that she could not entirely control. "Don't worry, ma'am," the cowboy said, water dripping off his hat brim in a steady curtain. "I meant to do that." Adelaide laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the kind she produced at supper tables when someone made a witticism. It came up from somewhere lower and louder than she'd intended, and lasted longer than was strictly dignified, and she did not stop it. She couldn't. The image of the man crouched down having a civilized negotiation with a horse that had already decided to end up in a water trough. Regardless, it was the funniest thing she'd seen in 10 days of corsets and tea cakes and careful silence. When she finally recovered herself, he was still standing there, wet, with an expression of mild patient amusement. "I'm sorry," she said, though she didn't particularly sound it. "I'm Silas Mercer," he said. He did not apologize for being wet. "Adelaide Pembroke." "I know." He glanced at the horse, who was still standing in the trough, perfectly content. "You're the one Victor's been parading around since last Tuesday." Adelaide felt the laugh die somewhere in her chest. "Parading is a strong word." "Is it?" He said it like a statement, not a question. Then he pulled the horse's lead and said something quietly, and the animal stepped out of the trough and followed him toward the stable without any further drama, as though the whole incident had been a private experiment now concluded. Adelaide stood in the street for a moment, still warm from the laughing, trying to remember the last time she'd laughed like that. Actually trying to remember. She went back through 10 days, then 2 months before that of engagement preparations, then dinner tables with her father and his associates, and she came up empty. Couldn't remember. That frightened her more than anything else that had happened in Red Willow so far. She should have gone back to the hotel. Any sensible version of herself would have gone back to the hotel, resumed the appropriate schedule, and filed the laughing cowboy under local characters, and left it there. She almost did. She was 3 steps in the direction of the Calvert house before she turned around. Silas Mercer was leading the horse into the stable when she came to the door. "You negotiated with that horse," she said. He looked back over his shoulder. "I did. You lost." Debatable. He started unsaddling the animal. Horse wanted to stand in a water trough. Horse stood in a water trough. Nobody got hurt. Horse is satisfied. I call that a draw. You're soaking wet. I've been worse. He pulled the saddle free and set it on a rail. "Was there something you needed, Miss Pembroke?" Adelaide opened her mouth, and then realized she had no particular answer. She had followed him, because she was not ready for the laughing to stop, which was not a thing she could say to a man she'd met approximately 6 minutes ago. She reached for something sensible instead. "You said Victor was parading me," she said. That was rude. Silas considered this. He agreed. It was. He didn't follow it with an apology. He said it like a man who'd already decided what was true and then moved on. "Do you know Victor well?" "Well enough." He reached for a towel hanging on a nail and started working on the horse's back. "Grew up in the same town. Different parts of it. Does that mean?" He glanced at her again. He had a way of doing it brief, direct, then away as though he was being careful not to stare but wasn't interested in pretending she wasn't there. "Victor grew up in the part of town where people have parts to play. I grew up in the part where the playing gets done for them." Adelaide thought about that. She thought about it for longer than she intended. "That's not an unfair description of where I grew up too," she said, before she decided to say it. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Just a small recalibration. The way a man looks at something he'd categorized and then finds himself needing to recategorize. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" Someone who'd have walked back to the hotel already. Adelaide looked at him steadily. I thought about it. You didn't. No, he nodded once, as though this were data he would keep. Silas Mercer, he said again, this time like it meant something other than just an introduction. I know, Adelaide said. You told me. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Just evidence that one was possible. She left 10 minutes later, walking back toward the hotel with her hands in her skirt pockets instead of folded properly. And she didn't sort out until she was already in her room that she'd spent those 10 minutes asking him about the horse, about why the negotiating, why not the rope, why he'd crouched down to the animal's level instead of pulling up on the lead, and that he'd answered every question like someone who'd actually thought through why he did what he did, which was a quality she was not accustomed to finding in casual conversation. Victor came to collect her for supper at 6:30. He was immaculate. He asked how her afternoon had been. Good, she said. I walked. I heard there was some commotion near the livery. He helped her with her wrap. A horse in the street. Some cowboy's horse got loose, she said, which wasn't precisely a lie. It was nothing. Victor nodded. His hand was on the small of her back, guiding her toward the door. You should stay away from that end of town, he said. It was pleasant. It was firm. It was the voice of a man who saw no contradiction between those two qualities. The men who work the livery and the ranches, they're not our sort of people. Adelaide. It doesn't look well. Of course, Adelaide said. She let him guide her out the door. She smiled appropriately throughout supper. She answered the questions that were asked of her, and she thought about a horse standing in a water trough with perfect satisfaction, and a wet cowboy who had decided the whole thing was a draw, and she kept the laughter tucked down somewhere behind her breastbone, like a coal that hadn't gone out yet. 2 days later, she went back to the livery. She told herself it was because she wanted to see about renting a riding horse for some afternoon exercise. This was true. It was also not the complete truth, but Adelaide was getting used to the fact that her internal life and her stated life had begun traveling in slightly different directions, and she was not yet sure what to do about the gap. Silas wasn't there. There was a younger man who set her up with a gentle roan mare and asked no questions about who she was or where she was headed, which she appreciated. She took the mare out along the eastern trail and rode for an hour without thinking about fabric selection or supper seating arrangements, or whether her opinions about banking policy were a liability. She felt approximately like a person. She was coming back along the edge of the pasture fence when she saw him, Silas, working with a young horse in the round pen attached to the Broken Spurs outbuildings, which sat just off the trail she'd taken. He wasn't doing anything dramatic. He was just moving in a slow circle at the end of a long line, letting the young horse figure out that the rope wasn't something to flee from. He saw her, raised a hand once in acknowledgement, and went back to the horse. Adelaide reined in and watched for a minute. Then she dismounted and looped her mare's reins over the fence rail and leaned on the top post because she wanted to see how it ended. You've got nothing better to do? Silas asked, not looking at her. I had a fitting this morning, Adelaide said, and a visit to the Beaumont sisters, and a tour of the space Victor has designated for my personal sitting room, which is quite small and faces a wall. Sounds like a full morning. I've had more productive ones. The young horse stopped and turned to look at Silas, trying to work out what was wanted. Silas said nothing, just stood and let the animal figure it out. After about 20 seconds, the horse stepped forward, tentatively on its own, and Silas rewarded it by immediately releasing the pressure on the line. Why do you wait? Adelaide asked, when it stops and looks at you. Because it's thinking. Silas walked a slow circle. If I push it when it's thinking, I teach it that thinking doesn't help. I want it to know that stopping and working out a problem is the right move. Adelaide was quiet for a moment. That's a remarkably sensible approach. Works with horses. Does it work with people? He glanced at her across the pen. Depends on the person. Some people, you leave them space to think. They work it out. Some people have had every decision made for them for so long, they don't know how to start. Which kind am I? The question was out before she'd fully decided to ask it. He stopped moving. The horse stopped too, watching them both. I don't know yet, Silas said. He said it honestly, not cruelly. Came back. That's a data point. She laughed. Shorter this time, quieter but real. A data point. Collect them. He got the horse moving again. You ride regular? I did before. Less opportunity in the city. Trails public land east of here. 8 miles before you hit the Kavanaugh fence line. Good riding. Victor mentioned I should stay near the main street. Silas said nothing. He didn't give a reason, Adelaide added. He doesn't usually have to, Silas said. In this town. The words landed without heat, just precision, and Adelaide felt them settle into the collection. She was quietly keeping the things she'd filed away since the train platform, since Horace's assessment of her eyes, since the fitting with the dressmaker whose opinion had already been formed. Picked up the mare's reins. "What's its name?" she asked, nodding toward the young horse. "Don't have one yet. You name them too early, they start believing you've decided what they are." He glanced at her again with that brief, recalibrating look. "I wait to see what they actually turn out to be." Adelaide mounted the mare. She sat there for a moment without saying anything, looking at the unfinished horse learning to think in the round pen. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Pembroke," he said, and didn't watch her ride away. She was back the next day, and the day after. By the end of the second week, she had met Maribel Ortega, who ran a small seamstress shop 2 blocks off the main street, the blocks Victor had not specifically pointed out to her. Silas had introduced them without ceremony. "This is Maribel. She makes things that actually fit people." Maribel had looked Adelaide over with the frank appraisal of a woman who sewed for real bodies rather than fashion plates, and said, "You ride?" "I'm starting to again," Adelaide said. Maribel had disappeared into the back of her shop and returned with a pair of boots worn, resoled twice, but solid and broken in properly. "My daughter's. She's in Denver now. You're about her size. Try these." Adelaide tried them. They were not appropriate for a banker's parlor. They were the most comfortable things she had put on her feet in 9 months. "Take them," Maribel said. "Girl needs proper boots if she's going to ride. Can't just take them. You want to pay for them. Pay me later. You want to argue about it. I've got work to do." Maribel sat back down behind her sewing machine with the decisive energy of a woman who had made the offer once and wasn't making it twice. Adelaide took the boots. She didn't wear them to supper. She kept them under the hotel bed and put them on only when she was heading to the trail or to the round pen or, increasingly, just to sit in Maribel's shop while Maribel sewed and talked and occasionally said things about Red Willow and Horace Halstead with the precise, economical candor of someone who had watched the machinery of a small town for 20 years and had no particular investment in pretending it was prettier than it was. "Halstead Bank," Maribel said one afternoon, not looking up from the hem she was pinning. 15 years I've watched them work. You want to know how a town stays poor? I'll show you the ledger." "I don't have access to the ledger," Adelaide said. "Not yet." Maribel bit a thread. "But you will. Be surprised what a future daughter-in-law gets left on desks." She looked up. Or maybe not surprised. "Sharp girl like you, Maribel." "I'm not saying anything." She went back to pinning. Just saying. Eyes open. Victor noticed, within 10 days, that Adelaide's afternoons were no longer predictable. He brought it up at supper on a Wednesday, in the way he brought things up not directly, never directly, but with a surrounding pressure that was all the more effective for being invisible. He mentioned that several of the matrons had commented on Adelaide, walking alone near the less fashionable end of town. He mentioned that it created impressions. He said this warmly, as one who was concerned for her reputation. "I've been riding," Adelaide said. "The trail east of town." Of course, Victor cut his meat with precise movements. "Though I wonder if a riding companion might be more appropriate. One of the Beaumont girls, perhaps." "The Beaumont girls don't ride." "Then perhaps closer to town." He set down his knife. "Adelaide, I don't want to seem controlling. I hope you know that." He said it sincerely. She almost believed it was sincere. "But in Red Willow, who you associate with says things about who you are. I need you to understand that my position, our position, after the wedding requires a certain kind of presentation. I'm asking you to be thoughtful." "I'm always thoughtful," Adelaide said. "Of course you are," he smiled. "I know that. That's one of the things I find most admirable about you." She thanked him. She finished supper. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, not because she was going to cry, but because she needed a moment where nobody could see what her face was doing. She thought about what Silas had said. The first time she'd described this particular dynamic to him, which she'd done sideways, without naming names, because old habits were difficult to dissolve. "That's called managing," Silas had said, not looking up from the hinge he was replacing on the paddock gate. "When a person makes you feel like they're being reasonable while they're telling you what to do." Doesn't feel like control because there's no shouting. Is it control? She'd asked. What would you do if you said no? He'd said. She hadn't answered. She'd thought about it for 4 days before she admitted to herself that she didn't know. Because she'd never actually tried. Because she'd always found a way to want something close enough to what was wanted from her that the question never fully arose. Until Red Willow. Until riding boots under a bed and a horse in a water trough, and a woman with a sewing machine who said eyes open, like it was both a warning and an invitation. Until she'd started counting the small distances between her actual thoughts and the sentences she actually said, and discovered the distance was growing. The crisis came on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week, in a way that Adelaide had not anticipated because she'd been watching for the wrong kind of problem. She had ridden out to Broken Spur because Silas had mentioned there was a mare due to foal, and he'd said she could watch if she wanted. No obligation, just that watching a foaling was something a person ought to see once. She'd arrived to find the foaling already finished the foal, standing on improbably uncertain legs beside the mother, while Silas crouched on his heels nearby watching both of them, and she'd been standing at the paddock fence for 10 minutes in. Genuine quiet pleasure when she heard raised voices from inside the main ranch house. Not shouting, but the kind of voices that are attempting not to shout. Horace made his position clear last month, a man's voice said, and Adelaide recognized it without pleasure. The extension isn't something we can offer. The bank has exposure. Victor. Inside the Broken Spur ranch house. Adelaide stood very still. My family has banked with Halstead for 11 years. She didn't know that voice. Older. Rougher. 11 years and we've never missed more than 6 weeks. And that was when my wife was dying, and your father knew that. Business conditions change, Victor said. The cattle sickness wasn't my fault. The rougher voice was struggling. Not with anger. With something more difficult. It came through 3 counties. Every rancher in this territory took losses. You know that. I do know that, Victor said. But the bank's position is going to put my family in the street. The rougher voice broke on the last word, just slightly, then steadied. My grandfather built that house. My children were born in that house. I am asking you for 6 more months. Pause. The bank will review, Victor said, the formal application when it's filed in writing. Adelaide's hands had closed on the fence rail. Silas had come to stand beside her. She hadn't heard him move. He was looking at the ranch house, not at her. 3rd this week, he said quietly. 3rd what? 3rd rancher he's visited. Silas's voice was flat in a way she'd learned meant he was controlling it. 3 families, all with accounts at Halstead. All of them took losses in the spring sickness. All of them asking for extensions. And, Adelaide said, though she already felt the shape of the answer, and nobody's getting one. He glanced at her sideways. Ranch comes up for sale after a foreclosure. Horace buys it at a fraction of value. Been doing it for years with smaller properties. Now the plan's gotten bigger. He paused. 3 of those properties adjoin each other. If Broken Spur goes under 2, the combined land is large enough for a serious cattle operation. The Halsteads have a buyer from Cheyenne already interested. Adelaide stared at the foal, who was figuring out its legs with improbable courage, entirely unaware that the ground it stood on was already being assessed by someone who had not yet paid for it. That's not banking, she said. That's predation. Yes, Silas said, simply. Silas, she turned to look at him fully. Is Broken Spur on that list? He took about 3 seconds to answer. The owner's name is on a document I shouldn't have seen. Yes. So you're on the list. I work here. I don't own it. But the people who do, he trailed off. They've got a daughter finishing school in Laramie. Was going to come home to a ranch. Adelaide turned back to the house. Victor was walking out of it now, hat on, expression composed, exactly as though he'd had a pleasant business conversation, rather than told a man that his grandfather's house was no longer negotiable. Victor saw Adelaide. His composure didn't crack. He walked to her at the fence and said, pleasantly, I didn't know you were riding out here today. I mentioned it might be a possibility, Adelaide said. He glanced at Silas briefly, dismissively, the way you glance at a piece of furniture that's in a slightly wrong position. You should come back to town. My mother's been asking about the centerpiece arrangements. In a moment, Adelaide said. Victor's smile held. Adelaide. In a moment, Victor. Something moved across his face, not anger, not yet. Something that was the architecture of anger still under construction. Then he nodded once, pleasant as ever, and walked toward his horse. Adelaide didn't move until he'd ridden 20 yards down the track. "Don't," Silas said. She turned to look at him. "Whatever you're thinking," he said. He wasn't looking at her, he was watching the foal. "Don't do it for me, or for Broken Spur specifically. You do it for wrong reasons. They'll use it against you, and nothing changes." "I'm not doing anything," Adelaide said. "You're planning something," Silas said. "I can tell because you've gone very quiet, and your hands are holding that fence rail, like you're trying to keep it in place." Adelaide looked at her hands. "Release the rail." "He had a man in tears," she said. "Yes." "The man's grandfather built that house." "Yes." And Victor reviewed the formal application. Her voice was controlled, as though a man weeping about his grandfather's house was a filing error. Silas said nothing. He understood when the space was for thinking. Adelaide stood there for a full minute. The foal took 6 increasingly steady steps and folded its legs and lay down in the late afternoon sun with the total confidence of an animal that has not yet learned what the world costs. "I need to see the accounts," Adelaide said. "That's a bad idea," Silas said. "My father sent correspondence to Horace," she said, "about the partnership arrangements between their 2 houses. Some of it is financial. Some of it may be more specific than either of them intended me to be able to read." She paused. "I understand bank ledgers, Silas. Not as a parlor trick. Studied it. I'm actually good at it." Silas looked at her. Full look this time, not the brief recalibrating one. "You find something, what do you do with it?" "I don't know yet. That's honest, at least." "I'm working on honesty," Adelaide said. "It's a recent development." He didn't laugh, but his mouth moved in a way that acknowledged the sentence. "You find something. Adelaide, your name gets tied to however it comes out. You know that." "Yes." "Victor's family has money and lawyers and every important person in this county at their dinner table." "Yes." "And you'd still—" "I haven't decided anything," she said. "I'm going to see what there is to see." She picked up her mare's reins and untied them from the fence. "And then I'm going to think." She looked back at him. "You said that was the right move. Let the animal stop and think." Silas rubbed the back of his neck, which she'd learned meant he was doing math he didn't entirely like the outcome of. "That was about a horse." "Yes," Adelaide agreed, and mounted. "Miss Pembroke." She looked back. "The founder's ball is in 11 days, Silas said. Victor's planning something at it." He said it carefully, not dramatically. "I don't know exactly. But the families I talk to, they think after the ball, the formal foreclosure notices start. He wants the public announcement of the wedding date first." Optics. Adelaide absorbed this, set it in the collection alongside everything else. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." She rode back toward Red Willow through the afternoon light, boots in the stirrups, hands loose on the reins, thinking with the specific, quiet intensity of a woman who had spent 24 years being managed and had just decided to understand the mechanism well enough to do something about it. She didn't know exactly what yet. She just knew she was done filing things away. She rode back into Red Willow with 11 days, and a problem she hadn't yet decided how to solve. The thinking she did that night was the real kind, not the kind where you arrange what you already believe into tidy order, but the kind that keeps pulling the rug out from under you. Adelaide sat at the small writing desk in her hotel room with a blank sheet of paper and her father's most recent letter in front of her, and she read that letter 3 times with different eyes than she'd used the first time. Edmund Pembroke wrote the way he did everything with confidence and compression, as though words were a resource to be used efficiently, and any sentiment that couldn't be expressed in 2 sentences wasn't worth expressing. He wrote about the weather in Philadelphia, about the merger discussions with Connell and Associates. He wrote, in the 3rd paragraph, that he trusted she was settling in well, and that the Halsteads were good people who would see her comfortably situated, which was the closest Edmund Pembroke had ever come to saying he hoped she was happy. Adelaide folded the letter. She put it in the desk drawer. She sat very still and thought about comfortable and situated, and what those 2 words contained, which was a life that fit her the way a house fits furniture adequately, without particular regard for what the furniture might prefer. She thought about the rancher's voice breaking on the word house. She slept badly. She was at Maribel's shop before 9 in the morning. Maribel opened the door, looked at Adelaide's face, and said, "Coffee first." She said it the way people say obvious things, without asking if that was what Adelaide wanted, because some things aren't questions. They sat in the back room where Maribel kept her serious sewing machine and her boxes of thread organized by color in a system that Adelaide had spent 3 visits trying to decode and finally given up on. Maribel's coffee was strong enough to be impolite, and Adelaide drank it without complaint. "The Burrows family," Adelaide said. "Do you know them?" Maribel looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Roy and Celia Burrows. 3 kids. Ranch east of town, about 6 miles." She paused. "Roy's grandfather built the house. Roy's been banking with Halstead since before Horace's hair went gray." "Victor visited them yesterday," Adelaide said. Maribel set her cup down. She didn't say anything. She had a gift for the kind of silence that invited a person to keep going without the pressure of being asked. "He visited 3 families in 3 days," Adelaide continued. "All of them carrying cattle sickness losses. All of them asking for extensions." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Nobody is getting extensions." "No," Maribel agreed. "They won't. You knew." "I suspected." Maribel picked up a piece of work she'd had waiting a child's collar that needed reattaching and started on it without looking up. "Horace has been buying foreclosed properties for 15 years. Small ones first. Nobody connected the pattern because each one looked individual. Unlucky family here. Defaulting business there." She bit a thread. "But the properties east of town, those are different. Those are adjacent. You put those 3 ranches together with Broken Spur, and you've got something significant. Silas told me there's a buyer from Cheyenne." "There is." Maribel still didn't look up. "Fellow named Garfield. Cattle operation. Big money behind it." She paused. "Horace has been managing the acquisition quietly for 2 years. Victor handles the visible part, the banking conversations, the extensions refused, the foreclosure paperwork filed properly and legally." "Legally," Adelaide said, with the precise inflection of someone for whom the word had just shifted meaning. "Legal isn't the same as right," Maribel said, "but it's what holds up in a court." She finally looked up. "What are you thinking about doing?" "I don't know yet." "Yes, you do. You just haven't decided if you're brave enough." Maribel said it without cruelty, just as a fact about the geography of the situation. "Question isn't whether you can see it. The question is whether you're willing to be seen seeing it." Adelaide sat with that for a moment. "My father sent correspondence to Horace," she said, "about the partnership terms between the Pembroke Capital and the Halstead Bank. There are financial documents. I've seen the edge of them, the covers of the folders, not the contents." She paused. "Victor keeps them in Horace's study. I've been to that study twice for social calls." Maribel looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to the collar. "Door to Horace's study," she said conversationally, "has a sticky latch. For years. If you lift the handle slightly while you turn it, it opens without the key." Adelaide stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I sewed for Horace's wife for 12 years, Maribel said. "Martha Halstead. Before she died. Something moved across her face, not grief exactly, but its long-settled residue. Martha asked me to bring her a letter from that study once, when she was too ill to get out of bed. I went and got it." She paused. "She never asked me what else I saw in there. Smart woman Martha. Knew when not to ask questions." The room was quiet, except for the sound of Maribel's needle moving through fabric. "Maribel," Adelaide said, "I need to understand what I'm looking at if I find something. The financial structure of a foreclosure plan, I can read it, but I need to know what specifically would constitute mites." "Evidence," Maribel said. "Something usable." Maribel set down the collar. She stood, went to the front of the shop, checked that the street was ordinary, and came back. She sat down. "There's a man named Cutler," she said. "Theodore Cutler. He's a land attorney, works out of Cheyenne, but he comes through Red Willow twice a year on circuit. He's not a friend of the Halsteads. They've had disagreements about boundary surveys." She paused. "If you could show him correspondence that demonstrated Horace was coordinating the foreclosures in advance, knowing the losses would happen, planning the acquisitions around them rather than responding to financial risk, that is a different legal picture than a bank making hard business decisions." "That's fraud," Adelaide said. "That's a strong word that would require strong evidence," Maribel said. "But yes, if Horace knew about the cattle sickness spread before he stopped approving extensions, if he used that knowledge to position his acquisitions, then what looks like banking is something else." Adelaide stood up. She paced to the window and back twice, which was all the room allowed. "I need access to those documents." "You need a reason to be in that house," Maribel said. "Victor invites me there regularly." "Then get invited." Maribel picked the collar back up. And then remember about the latch. Adelaide walked back to the hotel in the late morning light, with her mind doing the specific, precise work she was best at, not panicking, not dramatizing, but constructing the architecture of a problem and identifying where the load-bearing walls were. She'd done this with figures, with accounts, with the financial puzzles. Her father's associates had sometimes set her as what they called tests, and what she'd always recognized as their version of entertainment, with the only sharp female mind in the room. She'd solved every one of them. She'd been careful never to make the men feel too uncomfortable about it. She was done being careful about that. Victor came to the Calvert house at noon, as he did most Tuesdays, to take her to the hotel restaurant for a proper lunch. He was punctual, well-dressed, and in good humor, which Adelaide had learned meant nothing had gone wrong in his world that morning. He held her chair. He ordered before asking what she wanted, which he'd done 3 times now, and which she'd stopped mentioning, because it didn't change. "I've been thinking," Adelaide said, over the soup course, "that I've been somewhat removed from your father's household, given how close we are to the wedding." Victor looked up. Something shifted briefly in his expression: interest, recalculation, and then settled back into pleasantness. "I'm glad you've been thinking that way. I'd like to spend more time there," she said. "Help with the arrangements. Get to know the house better." She paused. "I thought perhaps this week I might come by on Thursday afternoon. Your father mentioned his housekeeper has been managing the preparation lists, and I could take some of that burden." "Of course," Victor said, and his smile this time was genuine in a way that was almost worse, because he was genuinely pleased that she was moving, voluntarily, toward becoming what he needed. "I'll tell Mrs. Finch to expect you. I don't want to be any trouble," Adelaide said. "You could never be trouble," Victor said warmly. She looked at her soup. She was at the Halstead house on Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, in her most appropriate dress, with her most appropriate expression. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, was a practical woman in her 50s who had managed Horace's household for 9 years and showed a combination of efficiency and careful political awareness that Adelaide recognized as the survival mechanism of a woman who knew exactly whose house she lived in. They went through the preparation lists together: linens, silver, the arrangements for the wedding supper, and Adelaide was helpful and attentive and thorough, in exactly the way that made a housekeeper feel that a new mistress of the house would be a manageable addition to the existing order. At 4 o'clock, Mrs. Finch went to the kitchen to oversee the evening meal preparation. Adelaide, who had noted the study's location on her first visit and confirmed it on her second, walked down the hallway with an unhurried step and lifted the study's door handle slightly while she turned it. The latch released without a sound. The study smelled of tobacco and old paper and the particular density of a room where significant decisions had been made over many years. She did not stand in the doorway. She went directly to the desk, because she had 11 minutes she'd counted the time between Mrs. Finch's kitchen departure and the point at which the evening meal would require her supervisory attention, and she did not have 11 minutes to waste. The folders were in the lower right drawer, which was not locked. This surprised her and then didn't. Horace Halstead was a man who'd never had to worry about who might look in his drawers, because the people in his house had always been people he'd chosen for their compliance. He hadn't considered Adelaide as a variable, because Edmund Pembroke's daughter was not supposed to be a variable. She found the correspondence in the third folder. She read quickly, the way her tutors had taught her when she'd asked to learn the same speed-reading techniques the male students used at the university her brother attended. She read the way a person reads when they know the time is finite and the stakes are not abstract. She was looking for 2 things: the timeline of Horace's acquisition plans and any correspondence that predated the cattle sickness outbreak. She found both. There was a letter from Horace to the Cheyenne buyer Garfield dated 14 months ago. In it, Horace described the properties east of town in specific detail, including the financial vulnerability of 3 named families: the Burrows, the Chenneys, and the family who owned Broken Spur, a man named Pat Dolan, and his assessment of the conditions under which those properties would become available for purchase. The letter was careful. It used banker's language. But the architecture of it was unmistakable to anyone who understood how the structure worked. Horace had not merely anticipated that these families might default. He had planned for it, coordinated around it, and positioned the bank to benefit from it. 14 months ago, The cattle sickness had swept through the territory 8 months ago. Horace had known which families were most vulnerable before the sickness came. He'd used that vulnerability as the fulcrum. There was a second letter, shorter, from 6 months ago. Garfield confirming that the agreed price per acre for the combined properties remained firm, contingent on clear title by the end of the current calendar year. End of the current calendar year, 5 months from now. The founder's ball was in 10 days. Adelaide did not take the letters. She put them back in the folder, in the same position, facing the same direction. She closed the drawer. She walked back to the sitting room and was looking at the wedding preparations list with a pencil in her hand when Mrs. Finch returned from the kitchen 7 minutes later. "How are we getting on?" Mrs. Finch asked. "Very well," Adelaide said. "I had a question about the flower arrangements. Do you know if Mr. Halstead has a preference regarding the dining room centerpiece?" They discussed centerpieces for 12 minutes. Adelaide made 2 genuine suggestions that Mrs. Finch seemed to find sensible. She left the Halstead house at 5 o'clock, with her posture correct and her hands steady, and the knowledge of what she'd read organized carefully in a mind that had spent 24 years being told it was too active for its own good. She went directly to the livery trail. Silas was on the eastern road, heading back from Broken Spur, when she found him or he found her, since their paths crossed at the junction, and he reined in with the particular alertness of someone who reads faces the way he reads horses. He took one look at hers and said, "What happened?" "I found the letters," Adelaide said, "in Horace's study." Silas was quiet. His horse shifted under him, and he steadied it without looking away from her. 14 months ago, Adelaide said, he wrote to the buyer before the cattle sickness. He named the families, he named the properties. He described their financial vulnerabilities, like she stopped. A shopping list. Silas exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the only thing he did. But it told her everything that he'd suspected something like this, that knowing it for certain was still a different weight from suspecting. "Garfield gets the land by end of year if foreclosures proceed," she said. "That's why the founder's ball matters. Victor wants the wedding announced publicly first. Optics. The bank's respectable son marrying the Eastern financier's daughter the same week they start stripping ranches from families." "I figured it was something like that," Silas said. He looked at the trail for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know the exact shape of it yet," Adelaide said. "But I need to understand the ranchers' actual debt positions. Not what Horace says they owe, what the real contracts say." "Do any of the families have copies of their original loan agreements?" "Roy Burrows keeps everything," Silas said. "Has a tin box under his floorboards going back 20 years. His wife thinks it's excessive. Roy says a man who doesn't keep his own records deserves what happens to him." He paused. "He's not wrong. I need to see those records," Adelaide said. "And I need to talk to someone who understands contract law." Maribel mentioned a man named Cutler, Ted Cutler. Something crossed Silas's face, not quite approval, but adjacent to it. "He's sharp. He's honest. He's in Laramie until the 3rd week of the month." He looked at her carefully. "You start pulling this thread, Adelaide. You know what unravels. I know. Your engagement. I know your father's relationship with a man he's chosen to trust with his daughter's future. I know, Silas. Your place in this town, which right now is protected by a family that has influence over every merchant, every civic decision. I know all of it," Adelaide said. She said it without anger. "I cataloged it the night before I went into that study. I sat there, and I went through every consequence, and I decided that I would rather know what I'm choosing than pretend I don't understand the options." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to be involved. I'm not asking you to put Broken Spur at more risk than it already is. Pat Dolan's already at risk whether you do anything or not," Silas said. "So is Roy Burrows. So is Caleb Cheney." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The familiar math. You need someone who knows which ranchers to approach and how to approach them without it getting back to Victor." "Yes. Someone who can ride to the neighboring settlements and find out if there are cattle buyers who'd be willing to work around Halstead." "Yes. That's about 2 weeks of hard riding," Silas said. "I know." He was quiet for a long moment. The evening was coming in, the light changing from afternoon to that particular quality of the hour before dark when everything gets briefly more vivid. His horse snuffled, and he absently scratched its neck. "Tell me what you need first," he said finally. She told him. She laid it out the way she'd organized it, the document she'd found, the timeline, The financial structure she believed was underlying the acquisitions. The legal argument she thought could be constructed if the rancher's original contracts showed what she suspected they would show. She talked for 20 minutes. Silas listened the way he listened completely, without interrupting, with an attention that was rare enough in Adelaide's experience that it still surprised her slightly. When she finished, he said, "Roy Burrows hates bankers. Has since Horace called in a short-term note on him in 1881 over a paperwork technicality. Lost 2 months of operating capital." He paused. "He'll talk to you. But you have to go without Victor knowing." "I can manage that," Adelaide said. "Can you ride out to the Burrows ranch without being seen from the main road?" "I went to your round pen 6 times without Victor noticing," Adelaide said. "Fair point." He looked at her the full look, the recalibrating one that she'd started to recognize as his version of something more than he was going to say directly. "You're different than when you got off that train." "I've had better boots," Adelaide said. The corner of his mouth moved. Then it became an actual thing, not a full grin, but enough of one. "Come out to Broken Spur Saturday morning. I'll have Roy Burrows there. Pat Dolan too, probably. They're going to have questions." "So will I," Adelaide said. She rode back in the gathering dark, thinking about Roy Burrows and his tin box under the floorboards, about a man who'd been right about keeping his own records, even if it hadn't saved him yet. She thought about what her tutors had taught her about compound interest and about what nobody had taught her about how a financial instrument could be a weapon if the person holding it wanted it to be. She thought about Victor's face at lunch, the genuine pleasure, when she'd suggested coming to the Halstead house more. The warmth of a man who saw his arrangements proceeding correctly, and she felt something she couldn't quite name, which was adjacent to sadness, but not exactly that. More like grief for a version of things that had never actually existed. Victor was not a monster. He was something more ordinary, and in some ways more troubling. He was a man who genuinely believed that Adelaide's value was best expressed through her compliance, and who had never once examined that belief because no one had required him to. She had stopped requiring people to examine their beliefs a long time ago because it was easier not to. She was done with easier. Saturday arrived with the specific clarity of a morning that hasn't decided yet what it's going to be, and Adelaide left the hotel at 7:30 telling no one anything, which was a new behavior that sat on her, with the mild discomfort of a garment cut slightly wrong and the deeper satisfaction of something that fit the actual shape of her. The Burrows Ranch was 6 miles east, on a trail that bent around the edge of a dry creek before it opened into the flat grassland, where the house sat square, functional, built from good lumber that had been maintained carefully over decades. She'd half expected what she found, Silas's horse already tied at the rail, and Roy Burrows on the porch watching her come in with the expression of a man who has decided to be skeptical of something before he knows what it is. He was in his late 50s, with the particular weathering of a man who has worked outside in Wyoming for 3 decades, not aged so much as consolidated, all unnecessary softness burned away by years and weather. He watched her dismount, and his face did not change. "Mr. Mercer says you want to see my loan agreements," he said. No preamble. "I do," Adelaide said, "and I'd like to tell you what I found in Horace Halstead's study before you decide what I'm worth listening to." Roy looked at Silas, who had come to the porch doorway. Silas gave the smallest nod of his head. Roy looked back at Adelaide. "You're the one he's marrying." "Not if I can help it," Adelaide said. Roy's expression shifted by 1 degree. Not warmth, not yet, but the opening of a possibility. "Come inside," he said. "Celia's got coffee." Celia Burrows was a woman shaped by the same decades that had shaped her husband, but differently. Where Roy had consolidated into watchfulness, Celia had consolidated into efficiency. She had coffee on the table before Adelaide had taken off her riding gloves, and she sat down across from Adelaide without asking if that was acceptable, because this was her house and she sat where she liked. Silas stood by the door, not performing nonchalance, genuinely comfortable on the edge of things, which was, Adelaide had come to understand, his natural position. He watched and he listened and he spoke when something needed to be said. And he was one of the few people she'd met who seemed to understand that those were not always the same moment. "Tell me what you found," Roy said. She told him. She watched his face while she told him. It went through several stages that would have been, in a more polished man, concealed. Roy Burrows did not conceal them. There was recognition first, the confirmation of something he'd suspected, and then a specific type of fury that was older than the current situation, that came from years of watching something happen around him without being able to name it precisely. And then, underneath both of those, something that was harder to look at, which was the expression of a man calculating what it means to be told your worst fear is not paranoia but fact. When she finished, Roy was quiet for a long time. 14 months, he said. Yes, before the sickness. He turned his cup in his hands. He knew. He planned around it, Adelaide said carefully. The letter doesn't say he knew the sickness was coming, but he'd already identified which families were most exposed. When the sickness arrived, he used that exposure. Same thing, Celia said quietly from across the table. Roy set the cup down. He stood up, went to the corner of the kitchen, and lifted a floorboard that was barely distinguishable from the others. He pulled out a tin box, the kind used for storing important papers against fire and flood, and set it on the table and opened it. The original loan agreement was on top. Roy had kept everything the original terms, the renewal agreements, 2 letters from the bank regarding the cattle sickness impact, and he spread them on the table with the hands of a man who had handled these documents so many times he knew each one by touch. Adelaide pulled them toward her and started reading. She read the way she'd read in the study, quickly, precisely, looking for specific things. The original loan terms were standard. The renewal terms were also standard. But the third document, a letter from Horace dated 2 months after the cattle sickness losses, in response to Roy's request for an extension, used a clause that Adelaide had to read 3 times before she was certain she was reading it correctly. Mr. Burrows, she said, this clause here, section 4, paragraph 2. Your original agreement requires Halstead Bank to provide written notice 60 days in advance of any foreclosure proceeding, not 30 days. 60. Roy looked at the document. He looked at Adelaide. Victor told me I had 30 days, he said. Yes, Adelaide said. He did. That's not what your contract says. The silence in the room had a specific texture. That's a legal violation, Silas said from the doorway. He said it quietly, evenly. It would need to be argued by someone who understands Wyoming property law, Adelaide said. But yes. If the other 2 families' contracts have similar clauses, and if Halstead Bank has been giving 30-day notices when the written agreements specify 60, then the foreclosure proceedings, as currently structured, may not be legally valid. Roy Burrows looked at his wife. Celia Burrows looked at her husband. The look lasted about 4 seconds and contained an entire conversation. Caleb Cheney's contract was drawn up the same year as mine, Roy said. Same attorney. Same bank. They'd have used the same standard form. And Pat Dolan? Adelaide asked. Pat's been with Halstead longer than any of us. Roy reached back into the tin box. I've got a letter from Pat here. He asked me to keep a copy because he didn't trust his own storage. He found it, passed it to Adelaide. She read it. She looked up. Same clause, she said. Roy sat down slowly, the way a man sits when the ground has shifted enough that he needs a moment to reorient. So what does this mean, he said. Practically. Practically, Adelaide said, it means that if you can refinance your legitimate debts before Halstead files formal foreclosure through cattle contracts. Through buyers outside this county, the 60-day notice requirement gives you time to make that happen. Time that Victor has not been including in his calculations because he believes you don't know you have it. Can we refinance? Roy asked. Is that possible? The losses were real. We still owe real money. The losses were real, Adelaide agreed. But the debt is manageable if it's restructured over a longer term, and the interest isn't predatory. There are cattle buyers in 3 neighboring territories who don't trade through Halstead. If those buyers were willing to offer forward contracts against your next season's stock, she paused. Someone would need to ride to those settlements. Talk to the ranchers there. Build commitment before the ball. She looked at Silas. 9 days, he said. 9 days, she agreed. Roy looked at Silas. You'd ride that? Silas rubbed the back of his neck. I'd need to borrow a second horse. Mine can't do the full circuit in that time alone. You can take the roan and the gray, Roy said, without hesitation. It was the voice of a man who had decided. It's going to get noticed, Silas said. Me being gone. Victor's going to ask around. Tell people you're looking at a horse purchase in Farwell County, Celia said. She said it the way she said everything with the brisk practicality of someone who has been solving problems in this household for 30 years. You do that regular enough. No one will question it. Silas looked at Adelaide. And you? I'm going to keep doing what Victor expects me to do, Adelaide said. Help with the wedding preparations. Visit the house. Be managed. She paused, and I'm going to write to my father. Your father, Roy said, carefully. Edmund Pembroke invested his capital in the Halstead partnership in good faith, Adelaide said. He is a hard man, and sometimes an ungenerous one, but he is not dishonest. And he does not like being outmaneuvered. She looked at her coffee cup. He also does not like it being demonstrated that his daughter saw something he missed. It's a gamble, Roy said. Yes, Adelaide agreed. But I know my father better than Horace Halstead does. And Horace made the mistake of assuming Edmund Pembroke's daughter was a decoration. Roy Burrows looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she hadn't expected, not about the plan, not about the bank, not about the 9 days or the riding circuit or the contract clause. He said, my grandfather built this house in 1847. Built it by himself over one winter, with 2 neighbors who helped him with the roof beams. He said afterward that the roof was the part you couldn't do alone, that every man needed someone to hold the other end. He looked at the table. I haven't had anyone hold the other end in a long time. Adelaide thought about the tin box under the floorboard, about a man who kept records going back 20 years because he knew at some level that the day would come when they mattered. You had the right records, she said. You just needed someone who knew how to read them. Roy Burrows put the lid back on the tin box and set it in the center of the table. And something in the set of his shoulders was different from how it had been when she'd walked through the door. 3 days later, Silas left Red Willow before dawn with Roy's roan and his own horse and a list of names that Adelaide had written out: ranchers, livestock buyers, settlement contacts from territories outside Halstead's reach, with notes on each person's likely position and what kind of argument would be most persuasive to each of them. Spent 2 evenings on that list. Silas had read it twice, asked 4 questions, and said, "This is good work." She hadn't expected to feel as much as she did when she said that. She hadn't expected to feel much at all, which told her something she wasn't quite ready to examine directly. Victor, meanwhile, was in excellent spirits. He took Adelaide to supper twice that week and was at his considerable best attentive, funny in his careful way, genuinely interesting when the conversation turned to subjects he cared about, which were banking and territorial politics, and occasionally literature. He was not a stupid man. That was the part that was genuinely complicated. He was educated and capable, and on the surface kind, and if Adelaide had arrived in Red Willow and found him, instead of finding Silas Mercer arguing with a horse in a water trough, she might have settled into the arrangement and built something workable out of it. She understood that. She didn't dismiss it. She held it alongside everything else, alongside the rancher's voice, breaking on the word house, alongside the letter dated 14 months ago with its shopping list of vulnerable families, alongside the 60-day clause that Victor had quietly ignored. She held all of it together, and she kept smiling. She was very good at that, and she had decided it would be the last time. The letter to her father was the hardest thing she wrote in those 9 days. She wrote it 4 times before she was satisfied with it, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she needed to say it in the specific language her father would receive. Edmund Pembroke responded to evidence. He responded to the logic of accounts. He did not respond well to emotional appeals or to the suggestion that he had been wrong, but he responded, she believed, to precision, to the demonstration that his capital had been committed to something that was not what it appeared. Chup. She wrote the 4th version in the tone of a clear-eyed financial analysis. She attached specific details from the document she'd found: the timeline, the Garfield correspondence, the clause discrepancy written from memory, with the accuracy of a woman who had been told her whole life that she had a better head for figures than was strictly appropriate, and who had decided, in the past 3 weeks, to take that as a compliment. She sealed the letter and posted it on a Tuesday, and then she did not think about it because she couldn't afford to. The founder's ball was in 5 days. Silas came back on a Thursday morning, 2 days before the ball, riding in through the east gate looking like a man who had covered significant ground in a short time. Adelaide met him at the livery. She'd been watching the trail all morning without admitting to herself that she was watching, and he dismounted and handed off the horses and said, 7. 7 ranchers, she said. 7 ranchers, 4 livestock buyers, 2 merchants in Clearwater who trade independent of Halstead's supply agreements. He reached into his coat and produced a folded packet, letters of intent. Not legal contracts, we'd need Cutler for that. But signed commitments from people willing to offer forward contracts to Burroughs, Cheney, and Dolan at fair terms, if the refinancing can be structured before the foreclosure proceeds. Adelaide took the packet. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. Silas, she said. It's not enough by itself, he said quickly. The way he said things, he needed her to hear clearly. You need Cutler. You need the documents from Horace's study, either copies or the originals. And getting originals means going back in there, which is, I know, she said. And the ball is in 2 days. If Victor makes the public announcement, before you have anything in place, it becomes the optics of it change. He'll say you're a woman who got cold feet. He'll say I turned your head. He'll make it about us instead of about the ranches. I know, Adelaide said again, which is why it has to happen at the ball. Silas looked at her. What does? All of it, Adelaide said. I can't move the pieces quietly enough to get in front of him. He has too much influence in this town and too little reason to suspect me, which works until it doesn't. The moment he realizes I've been gathering information, he moves. Files the proceedings, he manages my father's perception, he uses his position to make everything I've found look like the delusion of a woman who made an embarrassing choice. She looked at the packet in her hands. But if it happens in public, in front of everyone he's ever managed, he can't quietly manage that. That's a dangerous way to do it, Silas said. Yes, Adelaide said. He was quiet. You've been planning this for days. Since the study. He looked at her with that full look, not the brief recalibrating glance, but the real one, the one that lasted long enough that she was aware of her own heartbeat. You're not doing this because of me, he said. It wasn't a question. No, she said honestly. I'm doing it because of a rancher with a tin box who said he'd been waiting for someone to hold the other end. Silas nodded slowly. And me, Adelaide looked at him. At the dust still on his coat from 2 days of hard riding. At the tiredness around his eyes that was not complaint, just the physical record of the thing he'd done. You, she said, rode 700 miles in 9 days on 2 borrowed horses. 800, he said, roughly. You should sleep, she said. Probably. He didn't move. The ball's in 2 days. I know. Adelaide. He said her name the way he said important things without decoration. Whatever happens after whatever it costs, you make sure it's what you want. Not what you think you should want. Not what the plan requires. What you actually want. She thought about a horse in a water trough and a laugh that had come from somewhere she'd forgotten she had. I want, she said carefully, to be in the room when Horace Halstead discovers that the furniture has opinions. Silas looked at her for one more second. Then he laughed, really laughed, the unself-conscious kind, and it sounded like the most honest thing she'd heard in Red Willow. Kept that sound, too, in the collection she was keeping. 2 days, and the ball, and after that, whatever came next. The day before the founder's ball, Adelaide went back into Horace's study. She had thought about it carefully, not whether to go, but how. Because the 2 days of clear thinking since Silas returned had sharpened everything down to its necessary edges. She needed the originals, or copies precise enough to serve as evidence if the originals disappeared. She needed the Garfield letter and the correspondence detailing the foreclosure timeline, and she needed them in her own handwriting, transcribed accurately enough that a land attorney examining them would have what he required. The occasion presented itself without her having to manufacture one. Victor came to the hotel on Friday morning and asked if she would accompany him to the Halstead house to review the final arrangements for their table placement at the ball. He said it warmly, as he said everything. He held the door. He helped her into the buggy with the practiced ease of a man who had learned which small courtesies kept things running smoothly, and he talked about the ball who would be there, which families he wanted her to meet properly, the speech Horace planned to give before the dancing began. He's going to mention us, Victor said, formally. The announcement. I know, Adelaide said. You've mentioned it. I want it to go well. He glanced at her sideways with something that was genuine, not performed warmth, but actual wanting. I know this hasn't been. I know it's been a lot of change at once. I want you to know that I see that. Adelaide looked at the road ahead. She thought about what to say and settled on honesty in a limited form. I'm more prepared than you might think, she said. He seemed satisfied with that. At the Halstead house, Mrs. Finch had the table diagrams spread across the dining room table, and Victor sat with her, going through the seating with the methodical attention of a man who understood that social architecture was its own form of power. Adelaide stood beside him long enough to make 3 suggestions about placement, all of them genuinely good suggestions, because she had grown up at her father's table, and she understood exactly how these arrangements communicated hierarchy. And then she said she needed to use the necessary room, and Victor nodded without looking up. She went down the hallway. She went past the necessary room. She went to the study door, lifted the handle slightly, and went in. She had brought a small notebook, the kind she used for household lists, and that nobody would find remarkable in her pocket. She opened Horace's lower right drawer, still unlocked, still unguarded, because Horace Halstead had not yet considered his furniture an adversary, and she transcribed. Her handwriting was fast and accurate. She had 12 minutes, possibly 15 if the seating discussion ran long, which it would, because Victor had opinions about where the Beaumont family should sit relative to the Ames family, and those opinions were detailed. She wrote the Garfield letter first, because it was the most important. She wrote the key passages from the 2 supporting letters. She noted dates, she noted the property descriptions, she noted the specific financial figures. On the last document, the shortest, the one where Garfield confirmed the agreed price per acre contingent, on clear title by year's end, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her hand did not stop moving. She finished the sentence she was transcribing, closed the notebook, replaced the folder in the drawer, closed the drawer, and was 3 steps toward the bookshelf, examining the spines of Horace's legal volumes when the study door opened. Horace Halstead stood in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. His expression went through 3 phases in the space of 2 seconds: surprise, assessment, a conclusion she could not yet read. "Miss Pembroke," he said. "Mr. Halstead." She kept her voice pleasant with the ease of a woman who had been managing her face for 24 years. "I'm sorry, I hope I haven't overstepped. I was looking for Victor and took a wrong turn. I noticed your legal library and got distracted." She indicated the shelves. "I have something of a weakness for property law." Horace looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. "Property law," he repeated. "My father has an extensive library," she said. "Childhood habit." "Victor is in the dining room," Horace said. "Of course." She moved toward the door. He didn't step back immediately, a small assertion of space, a reminder of whose house this was, and then he did. And she passed him in the hallway, with her notebook in her pocket and her heart doing something athletic against her sternum that she was carefully not acknowledging. "Miss Pembroke," he said from behind her. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the study, looking at her with the expression she'd finally decoded, not suspicion exactly, but a recalibration of his prior assessment. The expression of a man who has been looking at something one way and has just noticed a detail that doesn't quite fit. "You'll find the ball tomorrow evening more comfortable if you wear something warm," he said. "The Grange Hall loses heat after midnight." "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." She walked back to the dining room. She looked at the seating diagram and made one more observation about the Cheney family's placement that Victor found sensible. She rode back to the hotel in the buggy with Victor's hand resting pleasantly on hers, talking about nothing important, and she did not take the notebook out of her pocket until she was alone in her room with the door locked. She checked her transcriptions. They were accurate. She read them through twice more, organizing the logic of what she intended to do, and then she sat at the desk and wrote 2 additional letters, one to Theodore Cutler in Laramie, which she would send by the morning post with a copy of the transcribed Garfield letter and the contract clause discrepancy, and one to Roy Burroughs, which she asked the hotel boy to deliver by hand before supper, telling Roy what she had and what she intended to do at the ball and asking if he would be there. Roy's reply came back in 2 hours, delivered by his youngest son, a boy of about 12 who handed her a folded paper with the solemnity of someone entrusted with important cargo. The note had 3 words in it: "Will be there." She slept. Not well, but she slept. The morning of the Founders' Ball, Adelaide stood in front of the hotel room mirror in her engagement dress for the first time since the fitting. The seamstress had done exceptional work. It was a cream-colored silk with fitted sleeves and a neckline that was elegant without being aggressive, and it sat on her well enough that even she could see, dispassionately, that she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be. The banker's chosen bride, the Eastern financier's accomplished daughter, the woman whose ring meant that everything was settled. She put on the engagement ring. She looked at herself wearing it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she did her hair, and she went downstairs, and she let Victor collect her. The Grange Hall was the largest building in Red Willow, a barn originally, retrofitted over 2 decades into a community gathering space that still had the honest bones of agricultural construction, which Adelaide found she liked better than she'd expected. By 8 in the evening, it held what appeared to be the entirety of Red Willow's social population, which meant merchants and their wives and ranchers in their best clothes, and the elected officials of the settlement, and the Beaumont sisters and Dr. Ames and the Calvert family, and, standing near the east wall with a group Adelaide recognized as Roy Burrows, and 2 men she assumed were Pat Dolan and Caleb Cheney, the people she'd been expecting. She did not look at them directly. She took Victor's arm and circulated the room with him, and smiled at the people he introduced her to, and answered the questions posed to her, which were mostly about Philadelphia and her father's business interests, and whether she was finding Red Willow to her liking. Very much, she said, approximately 14 times. Silas was not there. She had not expected him to be. The ball was not his world, and his presence would have made Victor alert in ways that would complicate things. But she felt his absence the way you feel the absence of something you've come to rely on, which was a feeling she tucked aside because this was not the moment for it. Horace opened the evening with remarks about the settlement's founding families and the progress of the territory, the kind of speech that is really a map of who matters and why. He was good at it, commanding without being pompous, historically grounded, genuinely proud of what Red Willow had become. Adelaide stood at the edge of the assembled crowd and listened and thought about Martha Halstead, who had been ill enough to send a seamstress to her own study for a letter, and wondered what Martha had thought about the man she'd married, and whether she'd known about the tin box things beneath the surface of his banking decisions. Probably, Adelaide decided. Smart woman Martha. Knew when not to ask questions. At 9 o'clock, Horace raised his glass. "There is one more item of particular happiness this evening," he said. The room arranged itself into the attentive posture of people expecting pleasant news. "My son Victor has found in this young woman," a nod toward Adelaide. She felt the eyes of the room turn to her like a physical thing. "A partner worthy of the Halstead name. We will set the wedding date officially. May 15th of next year," he smiled at her. "Red Willow gains a fine daughter." Victor raised his own glass and turned to Adelaide with his best expression, the one that was warmest and most persuasive. The one she'd seen him use on Roy Burrows, and on the Beaumont sisters, and on merchants who needed to feel they were getting something good. He used it now on her. She looked at him. She looked at the room, at the assembled faces of the people of Red Willow, at Roy Burrows and Pat Dolan and Caleb Cheney along the east wall, at Mrs. Finch standing near the serving table, looking at nothing in particular, at the Beaumont sisters with their champagne glasses raised. She looked at the ring on her hand. She took it off. The movement was small. It took perhaps 2 seconds. But something happened in the room, a collective change in attention, a leaning in, a shift in the air's quality that preceded understanding by about 4 seconds. "Victor," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, not dramatic, just clearly audible in a room that had gone very slightly quieter than it had been. "Can't marry you." The 4 seconds arrived. She had thought about how he would respond and had constructed 3 likely versions in her mind. She had been wrong about all 3. What crossed Victor's face was not anger, not yet, and not disbelief. It was something closer to incomprehension, the expression of a man encountering a variable that his model of the situation did not contain. He had no ready response for it because he had never built one. A woman removing the ring was not a thing his calculations had included. "Adelaide," he said quietly, an invitation to correct a mistake. "I'm not going to change my mind," she said, still the same steady voice. "And I need you to listen to me, because what I'm going to say concerns more people in this room than just us. This is not the place." Victor started. "I know it isn't," she said. "I know this is inappropriate and difficult, and I understand that it makes you look badly. I'm sorry for that part of it. I'm not sorry for the rest." The room had gone fully quiet now. The specific quality of silence that happens when people are watching something they did not pay to see, but cannot look away from. "Your father's bank?" Adelaide said, and she kept her voice at a conversational level, not performing, not declaiming, just speaking clearly enough to be heard by the people who needed to hear it, "has been denying extension requests to ranching families who suffered legitimate losses in the spring cattle sickness. Roy Burrows, Caleb Cheney, Pat Dolan at Broken Spur. She did not look at those men. Kept her eyes on Victor. I believe most people in this room know those families. They've been banking with Halstead for more than a decade each. Adelaide. Victor's voice had found its edge now. This is a family matter. It isn't, she said simply. It's a community matter, which is why I'm raising it here. Horace had moved through the crowd. He was beside Victor now, and the expression on his face was the one that had replaced assessment. It was the expression of a man who had recalculated and found the new number alarming. He said quietly, with a control that cost him something. Miss Pembroke, I would strongly recommend. I found correspondence in your study, Mr. Halstead, she said. She reached into the small evening bag at her wrist and produced the notebook. Letters between yourself and a buyer named Garfield in Cheyenne, dated 14 months ago, before the cattle sickness arrived. She paused. In those letters, you identified the Burroughs Ranch, the Cheney Holdings, and Broken Spur by name. You assessed their financial vulnerabilities. You described the conditions under which those properties would become available for purchase, and you agreed to a per-acre price contingent on clear title by year's end. The silence had taken on a different quality. 14 months ago, she said, the cattle sickness was still 8 months away, which means you were not responding to financial difficulty when you denied those extensions. You were creating the conditions for acquisitions you'd already planned. Horace's face was still controlled, but his hands, she noticed, had shifted a slight tightening of the one holding his glass. Those are private business documents, he said. Their contents are confidential, and your representation of them. I transcribed them accurately, Adelaide said. I was careful. You went through my private papers. Something had entered his voice, not the assessment anymore, not the recalibration. Something older and less managed. You went through papers entrusted to this house by your own father. My father trusted you with his capital, Adelaide said, based on his belief that Halstead Bank operated as a legitimate lending institution rather than a mechanism for systematic property acquisition through manufactured default. She looked at him steadily. When I write to him about what I've found, and I've already sent the letter, he will have his own view on whether that trust was appropriately placed. Victor stepped forward. He had found his composure or something that looked like it, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled and quiet in a way that was precisely calibrated to make her seem impulsive by contrast. Adelaide, listen to me. You've misread something you don't fully understand. Banking operations are complex, and a private correspondence taken out of context. Section 4, paragraph 2, she said. He stopped. Roy Burroughs' loan agreement, she said. Original contract, signed and witnessed. Section 4, paragraph 2 requires 60 days written notice before foreclosure proceedings may be initiated. She looked at Roy along the east wall. Roy met her eyes. You told Mr. Burroughs he had 30 days. Paperwork error, Victor said. Those things get standardized. It's not a paperwork error, Adelaide said. The same clause appears in the Cheney agreement and in Pat Dolan's agreement. All three families are owed 60 days, not 30. Which means if you file foreclosure proceedings on the current timeline, those proceedings are not legally valid. The room had stopped pretending to be at a party. Caleb Cheney said from the east wall, Is that true? He wasn't asking Adelaide. He was asking the room. I have an attorney in Laramie reviewing the documents, Adelaide said. Theodore Cutler. He will have an opinion within the week. The name landed. Cutler was known. Apparently she could see it in the room's response. The subtle shift of several faces toward something that was less skeptical. Victor turned to her with the quiet fury of a man who has had the landscape he thought he was standing on replaced. You've been planning this, he said, this entire time. You came to Red Willow and you used this engagements. I came to Red Willow engaged to a man I didn't choose. Adelaide said, and she said it without heat, because she didn't feel heat. She felt a very specific sadness that was real and not performed. I came here wearing a dress someone else selected and carrying a ring I was given rather than offered. And I tried, Victor. I genuinely tried to find a way to be what you needed. She paused. But you need someone who will stay quiet while you tell a man that his grandfather's house isn't negotiable. And I can't be that person. Victor stared at her. Something moved through his expression that was, for just a moment, actually human, not the calculation, not the careful management, but something real that didn't have a prepared response. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then the management came back over it. You will have nothing, he said, quietly. Precisely. No home here. No income. No social standing. My family has relationships with every I know, she said. Your father will be... I've already written to my father. Then you've made a very significant mistake, he said. The warmth was entirely gone. What was left was accurate. She thought this was the actual man, the one underneath the practiced pleasantness, and he believed what he was saying. He genuinely believed that without his name and his family's position, she was nothing. He had built his entire model of her on that belief. You'll find that Red Willow is a very small place for a woman with no protection and no prospects. Adelaide looked at him for a moment. She thought about a horse in a water trough, and an unlocked drawer, and a man who had ridden 800 miles on borrowed horses, and the rancher who had kept his papers in a tin box against exactly this day. She placed the ring on the nearest table. Losing all of that frightens me, she said honestly. I want to be clear about that. I'm not pretending it doesn't. But losing myself frightens me more. She turned and walked toward the door. The room parted for her. Not dramatically. People stepped aside the way people step aside when something is happening that they don't yet understand but recognize as significant. She felt their eyes. She felt the weight of every calculation being revised in real time as she passed who she was, what she'd done, what it meant for the social order of a small town that ran on exactly the kind of managed relationship she'd just publicly broken. She pushed through the Grange Hall door into the night air and stood on the step and breathed. Cold. Horace had been right about that. The cold hit her immediately, a sharp, clean Wyoming cold that had nothing polite about it, and she stood in her cream silk dress without a coat and breathed it in and felt, under the fear and the adrenaline and the residue of the last 20 minutes, something that she did not have an immediate name for. She heard the door open behind her. She turned, expecting Victor, and found instead Roy Burrows. He had followed her out, and behind him Pat Dolan and Caleb Cheney, and behind them a handful of other faces she recognized from the ranch territories, working people who had come to the ball in their best clothes, and who were looking at her with an expression that was different from the room inside. Roy said, "Was that true? What you said about Cutler?" "He has the documents," Adelaide said. "He'll respond within the week." Roy nodded slowly. "And the 60 days, and all 3 contracts. I read them myself." Roy looked at Pat Dolan, who was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with a face shaped by decades of outdoor work, and a specific kind of difficulty around his eyes, the difficulty of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had just been told that the ground under his feet might be more solid than he'd believed. "My daughter's coming home from Laramie in 3 weeks, Pat said. He said it to no one in particular, as though he were checking whether that fact still existed. "She'll have a ranch to come home to," Adelaide said. She said it not because she was certain, but because certainty was what was needed in this particular moment. She could afford to be uncertain later. Pat Dolan looked at her. He didn't say anything, but something in the set of his jaw released slightly not happiness. Nothing as clean as that, but the specific quality of a man who has stopped bracing. The door opened again, and this time it was Horace who came through, with Victor behind him, and the calculation on Horace's face had been replaced entirely now. What was there instead was something she recognized from her father's face when a negotiation went in an unexpected direction, not panic, but the fast-moving energy of a man who has identified a threat and is locating the response. "Miss Pembroke," Horace said, "I think we should speak privately." "I think we've had enough private conversations," Adelaide said. "The documents you described." Horace glanced at the men behind her and then back to her with the adjustment of someone changing the approach in real time. "Are subject to interpretation that requires context I'd be glad to provide. The acquisition discussions with Garfield were exploratory only. Bank examines opportunities. That is not criminal." "It may not be criminal," Adelaide said. "That's for Cutler to determine. But it's not what you told these men when they came to you for extensions." She turned slightly to include the ranchers in her sight line, without turning her back on Horace. "You told Roy Burrows that the bank had exposure and that business conditions had changed. You said nothing about having already agreed to a sale price on his land with a buyer from Cheyenne." That's Horace started. "Was there a buyer?" Roy said, directly to Horace. Not loudly, but with the weight of 11 years of banking relationship behind it. Horace looked at Roy Burrows. "Business relationships are confidential," he said. "Was there a buyer?" Roy said again. "Who you'd agreed to sell my grandfather's land to. Before you denied my extension. The door from the Grange Hall was open now. Several people had drifted out, not the whole room, but enough of it. Dr. Ames, the elder Beaumont's sister, two of the merchants who traded on Main Street. They were not interfering. They were witnessing, which in a small town amounted to the same function. Horace looked at his audience and made the calculation. Adelaide had been waiting for him to make the calculation about what could be managed and what couldn't, about which damages could be contained. Could see him making it. He was good at it, fast at it, 20 years of practice behind the speed. There will be a formal review, he said, of all outstanding extension requests. Given the exceptional nature of this season's losses, the bank will reconsider the timeline for 50 days, Roy said in writing, for all three families. Horace's jaw moved slightly. There are processes. You have the authority, Roy said. You've always had the authority. You chose not to use it. He paused. You going to tell me that changed? The night air held the moment. Horace looked at Victor. Victor's face was the most controlled thing Adelaide had seen all evening, the careful blankness of a man managing himself under conditions his preparation had not anticipated. He gave his father nothing. No signal, no suggestion. Just the same managed surface. Horace looked back at the assembled witnesses. He looked at Adelaide last. The review will take place Monday morning, he said. The families in question will be notified. He said it with the precision of a man dictating terms even when he is conceding them, because some men can only survive defeat by making it look like a decision. Roy Burrows said nothing. He didn't need to. Victor turned and went back inside without speaking to Adelaide. The door closed behind him. Horace followed after a pause that was its own kind of statement. People who had drifted out began to drift back in, carrying the story with them. And Adelaide stood on the step in her cream silk dress in the cold night and let out a breath that she had been holding for approximately 9 days. Roy came and stood beside her. Not close, just near. The way you stand near someone who has done something that cost them something, and you want them to know you see it without making a production of acknowledging it. Your engagement dress, he said after a moment. Yes, Adelaide said. You wore your engagement dress to end your engagement. I didn't have anything else appropriate for the occasion, Adelaide said. Roy made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family. Then he said seriously, What happens to you now? I don't know, Adelaide said. It was the truest thing she'd said all evening. You've got no place to stay past whenever Victor decides the hotel arrangement isn't his problem anymore, Roy said. I'm aware. Celia's got a room, Roy said, nothing fancy. But you're welcome to it. You need time to work something out. He said it the way he said things once, without ceremony, as though the offer were obvious, and he was just noting it aloud. Adelaide looked at him. You don't have to. You went into a man's study and wrote down the numbers that saved my grandfather's house, Roy said, in your engagement dress, while smiling at the man's son about centerpiece arrangements. He looked straight ahead. Room's not much, but it's yours. Adelaide stood there for a moment in the cold. Thank you, she said, and meant it without qualification. Silas told me what you were planning, Roy said, roughly. Not the details. Just that you had something in mind. He paused. I told him he ought to tell you something. What? That a person who plans like that and executes like that doesn't need looking after, Roy said. They need someone who can keep up with them. Adelaide was quiet. He said he knew, Roy said. The cold was genuine, and the silk was inadequate for it. And the Grange Hall behind her was buzzing with the altered social mathematics of a small town that had just watched its most settled arrangement upend itself. Adelaide stood on the step anyway, not ready to go back in, not ready to leave, just occupying the particular moment between the thing that had been and the thing that would be next. She thought about Silas, about him being somewhere on the edge of Red Willow right now, not inside the hall, waiting the way he waited, not anxiously, just with the patience of a man who understood that some things finished in their own time, and then you saw what they'd become. She thought about Roy Burrows offering a room, about Pat Dolan's face when she'd said his daughter would have a ranch to come home to, about Maribel saying eyes open like it was both a warning and an invitation, and Adelaide not understanding until now that it had been neither, it had been a gift. She had come to Red Willow in an ivory silk dress with 31 buttons, carrying a future she hadn't chosen. She was standing outside in the cold in a cream silk dress that was going to need cleaning, with no fiancé and no protection and no clear next step, and she was Underneath the fear and the cold and the practical reality of her situation, more herself than she had been on any of the days she'd spent being managed into the right shape. That was not nothing. She squared her shoulders. She was going back inside, because the night wasn't finished, and there were people in that room who had questions she was the best person to answer. And because Victor Halstead was not going to have the satisfaction of watching her stand in the cold. Pushed the door open and went back in. The room registered her return. She could feel it without meeting anyone's specific gaze, the shift in the room's attention. The small adjustments of people who had been discussing her and were now recalibrating in real time. She moved through it with her head level and her hands loose, and her engagement ring sitting on a table somewhere behind her, like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't written. Dr. Ames intercepted her near the center of the room. He was a careful man, deliberate with his words, with the steady-eyed quality of someone whose profession had required him to bring difficult news, often enough that he'd learned to do it without softening it into dishonesty. He said quietly, "What you said about Cutler, you're confident." "I sent him the documents yesterday," she said. "I'm confident in what I sent." He nodded. "My brother-in-law had a boundary dispute with the Halstead Bank 7 years ago," he said. "It was settled. He was always somewhat unclear on the terms." He paused. Cutler was his attorney. "Did it settle fairly?" Adelaide asked. "My brother-in-law thought so at the time," Dr. Ames said. "He wasn't certain afterward." Another pause. "If the review Horace announced does not proceed as stated, it might be worth knowing that." "It might," Adelaide agreed. He gave her a small nod, professional, precise, the nod of a man who had offered what he could and left the rest to be determined and moved away. The elder Beaumont sister appeared at Adelaide's left elbow without ceremony. "That," she said, with the tone of a woman who has made her judgment and is not interested in revising it, "was either the bravest thing I've seen in Red Willow or the most foolish." "Probably both," Adelaide said. The elder Beaumont sister looked at her with the sharp clarity of someone who had been observing the social architecture of this town for a long time. "Victor is not going to forgive this." "No," Adelaide agreed. "And Horace's review announcement may or may not hold," Adelaide said. "Which is why I've engaged Cutler, and why the ranchers need to move quickly on the refinancing while the 60-day window is established." The elder Beaumont sister was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Calvert's brother is a cattle buyer in Sheridan. He's been looking for reliable suppliers in this territory." She paused. "He doesn't trade through Halstead." Adelaide looked at her. "I don't suppose you'd know if he's received any inquiries recently regarding forward contracts for next season." The elder Beaumont sister's expression was entirely neutral. "I imagine I could find out," she said, and moved away. Adelaide stood in the center of the Founders' Ball in Red Willow, Wyoming, in the spring of 1886, in her former engagement dress, and felt the room beginning slowly, with the caution of people who had not yet decided what the new arrangement was, to reorganize itself around a different set of facts. Victor watched from across the room. He didn't approach her again. He stood near his father with the composed stillness of a man conserving himself, and his eyes on her across the room's width were the only indication that he had not entirely decided what to do next. She met his gaze directly. She held it for a moment. Then she turned away first, not because she was finished, but because she had other things to attend to, and Victor Halstead had ceased to be the most important thing in the room. Outside, somewhere on the edge of the cold Wyoming night, Silas Mercer was waiting with 2 horses. She knew this without having confirmed it. She knew it the way she knew the 60-day clause had been in those contracts before she'd read it, because she understood the shape of him now. And the shape of him was a man who showed up at the right time and left the choice about what to do with it entirely to her. She would finish what needed finishing in this room first. Then she would go outside. He was there. Not dramatically, not leaning against a post with his arms crossed like a man in a story who knows he's being watched. He was standing beside 2 horses at the edge of the livery yard, which was 2 buildings down from the Grange Hall, adjusting a stirrup that probably didn't need adjusting, because he was a man who needed something to do with his hands when he was waiting and didn't want to look like he was waiting. Adelaide came around the corner and stopped when she saw him. He looked up. "How bad?" he said. "Horace announced a formal review," she said. "Monday morning. Roy and the others will be notified." "You believe him?" "No," she said, "not entirely. But he said it in front of witnesses, and he knew Cutler's name, which changes the math on what he can quietly ignore. She came closer. Victor knows I had help. He doesn't know from whom yet. Silas nodded. He'd already figured that. He'll work it out. Yes, she said. Probably by morning. He looked at her the full look, not the brief one. She was in her cream silk dress in Wyoming, cold without a coat, which he registered without commenting on. Took off his jacket and held it out. She put it on. It was too large and smelled of horse and wood smoke and the particular outdoor scent that she had come to associate with every conversation that had actually mattered to her since she arrived in Red Willow. Roy offered me a room, she said. I know. I asked him to. She looked at him. You asked him. Figured you'd need somewhere that wasn't the hotel, Silas said. Victor pays that bill. He went back to the stirrup. Didn't want you making decisions under pressure about where to sleep. Adelaide stood there for a moment. She thought about all the men in her life who had made arrangements for her, and about how this felt different from every one of them. Not because the action was different, but because the intention behind it was. Every arrangement her father had made had been about managing her into the right position. This was a man making sure she had options, rather than making sure she had obligations. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Roy's doing you the favor. Roy's doing it because you asked. Silas didn't argue with that. He checked the second horse's girth and then straightened and looked at her. You should get out of that dress before you ruin it standing in the cold. The dress is already ruined, Adelaide said. I put it on to end an engagement. I don't think there's a second use for it. Something moved in his face. Not quite amusement. More like the recognition of a particular kind of courage that had chosen an unusual form. Come on, he said. He handed her the reins to one horse, just held them out and waited for her to take them. He didn't tell her which way to go. He stood there with his own horse and waited for her to make the first move. She took the reins. She chose the road to the Burrows ranch. They rode without much talking, which was a thing she'd come to understand about Silas. That silence with him was not a gap that needed filling, but a kind of conversation in itself. The kind where you're not performing attention, but just actually in the same space together. The moon was up, and the trail was clear enough, and the cold was sharp in a way that felt honest rather than punishing. And Adelaide rode in a man's jacket over her cream dress and thought about nothing for approximately 20 minutes, which was the first time in weeks she'd managed it. Victor's going to fight it, she said, when they were about halfway. Yes, he'll go after your reputation first, yours specifically. He'll say you turned my head, that the whole thing was mites. I know, Silas said. You're not worried. I'm some worried, he said, which she appreciated for its honesty. I've got no land, no significant money, and a history of having opinions about how Halstead Bank runs its business. Victor decides to make this about me personally. He's got material to work with. He paused. But the ranchers I rode to, the ones who gave me those letters of intent, they know me. Worked with most of them at one point or another. Victor tries to say, I'm some kind of con man who got a foolish girl to do his dirty work. He's going to run into a lot of people who'll say otherwise. A lot, Adelaide said. Enough, Silas said, probably. She heard the caveat and filed it. The refinancing has to happen before he can reorganize, she said. If Cutler confirms the 60-day clause, and we can get the forward contracts structured as legal agreements within that window. I know the timeline, Silas said. Been thinking about it since I got back. He glanced at her across the trail. You sleep tonight. Tomorrow morning, Roy's going to want to sit down with the three families and go through what they actually owe versus what Halstead claims they owe. You're going to need your head clear for that. I'm fine. You ended your engagement in front of the entire town 3 hours ago, Silas said, in your engagement dress. You're running on something, and when it wears off. I'll sleep when there's time to sleep, Adelaide said. That's what people say before they make mistakes, Silas said. Sleep tonight. Fight tomorrow. She wanted to argue with it and couldn't find the actual argument, which meant he was right, which meant she said nothing, which he took as agreement. He was learning her the way he learned horses, not by pushing, but by reading the signals correctly. Celia Burrows had the lamp on when they arrived. She opened the door before they'd tied the horses because she was a woman who stayed awake when she needed to stay awake and didn't pretend otherwise. She looked Adelaide over the cream dress, the man's jacket, the general evidence of an eventful evening, and said, Room's ready. There's soup on the stove if you want it. Adelaide wanted it. She sat at the Burrows' kitchen table at 11:30 in her engagement dress eating Celia's soup, which was the kind of soup that could only be produced
Someone who understood was made of soup.
the purpose of to make
Person feel that things were manageable and let the silence of a working household at the end of
a long day settle around her. Roy came in from checking the horses and sat at the table with his own cup and looked at the wall for a while, doing his own version of processing. Horace is going to walk back that review announcement, Roy said eventually. Possibly, Adelaide said. Definitely, Roy said. Man like that doesn't give ground unless he has to. Tomorrow morning, when there's no audience, he reframes it. Banking procedures. Sensitivity of commercial relationships. He finds the language, which is why we don't wait for him, Adelaide said. The 60G clock starts from the date of his verbal notice. If you take the position that his announcements to you already constitute that notice. Does it hold? Roy asked. It's arguable, Adelaide said honestly. Cutler will know better than I do. But the point is to put Halstead in the position of having to contest it legally rather than just procedurally. If he contests it in court, the letters I found become material evidence. He does not want that. Roy turned his cup in his hands. He had large hands, the hands of a man who had been doing physical work since he was 12, and they moved with a slowness that was not uncertainty, but the physical equivalent of careful thought. My grandfather, he said, came to Wyoming with $40 and a mule that had half a personality. Built this place over 20 years. Sent 3 kids to school past the primary grades. He paused. I'm not losing it to a man who made a business decision about it before I even knew I was in trouble. You're not going to, Adelaide said. Roy looked at her. You sound sure. I'm sure enough, Adelaide said. That's all you can ever really be. He seemed to accept that. He finished his cup and went to bed, and Celia showed Adelaide to the room, which was small and clean, which was small and smelled of cedar, and had a quilt on the bed that had been washed enough times to become the kind of fabric that holds warmth without effort. Adelaide took off the cream dress and folded it over the chair and thought, briefly, that she had no idea what she was going to wear tomorrow. And then she thought that this was among the less important problems she was currently managing. And she lay down under the quilt and was asleep within 4 minutes. She slept without dreaming. Or if she dreamed, she didn't remember it, which amounted to the same thing. Morning came with the particular clarity that follows hard frosts, and with it came the work. Roy had sent word by 6 in the morning to Pat Dolan and Caleb Cheney, and by 8 o'clock all 3 families were represented at the Burrows' kitchen table. Celia had made enough coffee for everyone and had put out bread without being asked and had then positioned herself at the end of the table with a pencil and her own ledger book, because she had been managing the household accounts for 27 years, and she was not going to sit in the next room while the decisions about those accounts were being made. Silas came at 8:30. He had brought, from wherever he'd spent the night, a packet of the letters of intent he'd collected from the neighboring territories, and he laid them on the table with the systematic care of someone who understood that paper evidence handled carelessly became less useful. Adelaide sat at the center of the table, with the rancher's documents, the original loan agreements, the bank correspondence, her transcribed copies of the Halstead-Garfield letters organized in front of her. She looked at the people around that table and felt, briefly, the weight of what they were trusting her with. Roy Burrows with his 20 years of carefully kept records. Pat Dolan, who had ridden 6 miles before sunrise, and whose face still carried the specific tiredness of a man who has not slept soundly in months. Caleb Cheney, who was younger than the other 2 early 40s, with a wife and 4 children, and the first real piece of land his family had owned in 2 generations. All right, Adelaide said. Let's start with what you actually owe. What followed was 3 hours of the most precise, difficult, and unexpectedly clarifying work Adelaide had done since she'd been old enough to sit at her father's table while the accountants went through the quarterly figures. The real debts stripped of the compounded late fees Halstead had been adding without clear contractual basis, stripped of the processing charges that appeared in the bank statements but not in the original agreements were significant but not insurmountable. The cattle sickness losses had been real and had set all 3 families back in ways that would take 2 to 3 seasons to fully recover from. The gap between what Halstead claimed was owed and what the contracts actually specified was, in 2 of the 3 cases, meaningful. They've been charging you a default fee, Adelaide said to Pat Dolan, pointing to a figure in his statements. That is not referenced anywhere in your original loan terms. It appears in the bank's own accounting form, but not in the contract you signed. Pat stared at the number. That's been there for 8 months. Yes, Adelaide said. And it compounds monthly. Remove that fee from the running total, and your debt is approximately $400 lower than what they've been telling you. Pat was quiet for a moment. $400, he said. He stopped. That's 3 months of operating margin, Silas said quietly from his end of the table. It's also, Adelaide said, potentially recoverable. If the charge was applied without contractual basis, you may have grounds to demand its removal from the principal. Cutler will know. Caleb Chaney said, mine too? Adelaide pulled his statement. She'd already seen it, had noted it during her review, had been waiting to confirm before saying so. Yours too, she said. Different amount, but the same fee structure. Caleb sat back in his chair with the expression of a man recalculating everything he'd been told for the past year. How does that happen, he said. How does a fee appear on a statement for 8 months and I don't? You trusted the statement, Adelaide said. You had no reason not to. The bank produces the document. The numbers look official, and if you're not comparing it line by line to a contract from 3 years ago, she paused. Most people don't. Most people trust that the institution is being accurate. That's how it works, Roy said grimly. He'd found the same fee in his own statements 10 minutes ago and had said nothing, just set his jaw and kept his face even. It works, Adelaide said, until someone checks. The room absorbed this. It was not a comfortable thing to absorb the understanding that you have been charged for something that was never agreed to, over a long enough period that the accumulated amount has materially affected your situation by an institution that is simultaneously threatening to take your land. It was the kind of thing that made a person want to do something immediate and physical, and Adelaide watched the men at the table manage that impulse with varying degrees of success. Okay, Pat said finally. The word came out steady, which seemed to cost him something. So the real numbers are different. Good. What do we do with the real numbers? Adelaide picked up Silas's packet of letters. 7 ranchers in neighboring territories have committed to forward contracts, she said. The terms are, they take a guaranteed percentage of your next 2 seasons' cattle output at agreed prices, paid in advance. The advance payment goes toward your debt reduction. The guaranteed price is lower than market peak, but above operating cost, which means you're exchanging maximum profit for security. She looked around the table. It's not the best deal in a good year. It's a survivable deal in a bad one. What are the numbers? Roy asked. She laid them out. She went through each family's situation individually, what they owed after the fee corrections, what the forward contract advances would cover, what the remaining debt looked like over a 3-year versus 5-year repayment structure, and what the monthly figure would be under each timeline. She did it from memory and from the notes she'd been assembling for 4 days, and she did it accurately. And she watched the faces around the table shift from the particular misery of people who have been told they are drowning to the different and more workable misery of people who are being told the exact depth of water and given a map of where the shallower parts are. The third option, she said, which requires the most and gives the most, is a cooperative structure. Rather than each of you refinancing independently, you pool your assets as a collective borrowing entity. Combined collateral, shared risk, shared benefit. The cooperative approaches the neighboring buyers as a single unit, which gives you substantially more negotiating leverage. It also means that if one family has a bad season, the others absorb some of that impact rather than the bank using it as a foreclosure trigger. Means we're tied to each other, Roy said. Yes, Adelaide said. Neighbors haven't always got along, Caleb said, in the tone of someone raising a real objection, rather than making conversation. No, Adelaide agreed, they haven't. That's a genuine risk. She paused. But you're already tied together by Halstead's plan. He needs all 3 properties for the combined acreage to be worth selling to Garfield. If one of you survives independently, the other 2 are more vulnerable, not less. You're already a unit in his calculations. The question is whether you want to be one in yours. The room thought about that. Pat Dolan looked at Roy Burrows. Roy looked at Caleb Chaney. Caleb was youngest and had the most to lose and the least history with the other 2, and he was the one the outcome would turn on, and he knew it. My father-in-law's a difficult man, Caleb said, to no one in particular. He told me buying this land was foolish, Told me twice a year for 4 years that I'd lose it. He looked at the table. I really don't want to prove him right. Good reason, Roy said, which was the most Roy Burrows had said in favor of anything in 3 hours. Caleb looked at Adelaide. The cooperative, how does it actually work? Legally. Cutler will draft the structure, Adelaide said. It will need to be formal articles of agreement, clear terms on contribution and benefit and dissolution if one party needs to exit. It will take time to set up correctly. She paused. But the 60-day window on your foreclosure notices gives you time if we start immediately. And if Horace walks back the Monday review? Roy asked. Then we file the cooperative structure through Cutler as a defensive action, Adelaide said. The act of filing establishes the timeline. Horace would have to contest it, which puts him back in front of the legal question of the letters. She paused. I don't think he'll want to be in front of that question publicly. The Garfield correspondence is not favorable reading. You sound like a banker, Pat said. He said it without hostility. More like a man noticing something unexpected. My father is a banker, Adelaide said. I spent 20 years listening at his dinner table. She looked at the documents in front of her. Mostly I was supposed to be decorative, but I was listening. Silas, from his end of the table, made no expression. Could feel him not making it. The meeting broke up at noon. The 3 families left with copies of Adelaide's notes and the letters of intent and the knowledge that the first step was to get word to Cutler that his services were needed immediately. Roy had already sent it to the telegraph office with a message to Laramie before the others arrived. Caleb Cheney, on his way out, stopped at the door and said to Adelaide, My wife was going to be at the ball last night. She wasn't feeling well. She'll hear about what happened. He paused. I want you to know she's not going to hear anything from me, except that you're the reason we might still have our land. Adelaide thought of several responses and chose the honest one. I haven't saved anything yet, she said. We're building the case. There's still a lot that has to go right. Caleb nodded. Still, he said, and left. The problem arrived that same afternoon. Adelaide was at Maribel's shop. She'd borrowed clothes from Celia Burrows, practical things that fit approximately, and that she wore without complaint, when Maribel put down her work and said, in the tone of someone who has heard something and is deciding how to present it, Victor went to the hotel this morning. I know, Adelaide said. He's paying the bill. He did more than check on the bill, Maribel said. He spoke with 3 merchants. Larson at the feed store, Walsh at the hardware, and the man who runs the telegraph. She paused. Telling them that you'd been acting under the influence of a ranch hand who had a financial interest in creating conflict with Halstead Bank. That whatever you said at the ball should be understood in that light. Adelaide absorbed this. He's moving faster than I expected. Victor's not stupid, Maribel said. He knew this morning that the room at the ball had shifted. He knows he can't undo what was said publicly. So he's not trying to undo it, he's reframing it. She picked up her work again. He's saying you were used. And Silas specifically, Maribel confirmed. The word being used is manipulated. That a vulnerable young woman, alone in a new town, formed an inappropriate attachment to a man who stood to benefit from disrupting her engagement to a reputable family. Adelaide thought about Silas riding 800 miles in 9 days on borrowed horses to collect letters of intent from strangers. She thought about what it would look like to people who hadn't watched him do it, the Cowboy, the Eastern girl, the broken engagement, the accusations against the banker's family. She thought about how the story Victor was telling had the advantage of being the story people expected. Fit the grammar of the world everyone here had grown up in. Does it have traction? She asked. Maribel was quiet for a moment. Some, she said honestly. Larson's on the fence. Walsh repeated it to 2 customers, which isn't the same as believing it, but isn't good either. She looked up. The telegraph man, I don't know him well enough to say. Telegraph is what matters, Adelaide said. She stood up. If Victor gets word to my father before Cutler, responds if he frames this to Edmund Pembroke, as a daughter who was taken advantage of by a scheming ranch hand. Your father will come, Maribel said. My father will come and he will be angry, Adelaide said. And the anger will be at the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Because Edmund Pembroke is a man who can be moved by evidence, but who reaches for the nearest available explanation first and holds on to it until something better physically takes it out of his hands. She was already moving toward the door. I need to send another telegram to my father before Victor does. The telegraph man? I'll handle the telegraph man, Adelaide said. The telegraph office was 3 buildings down from Maribel's shop. The man behind the counter was named Haskell, and he had the particular careful neutrality of someone who works at the intersection of other people's private communications and understands that his business depends on the confidence of everyone in town, which meant he could not visibly take sides. This was, Adelaide decided, actually useful. She came in, set her borrowed hat on the counter, and looked at Haskell directly. Mr. Haskell, I need to send a telegram to Philadelphia. Edmund Pembroke. She wrote the address on the form he slid toward her. I want to know if any telegram has already been sent to that address in the last 12 hours. Haskell looked at her carefully. I'm not asking for the contents, she said. Only whether one was sent. Miss Pembroke, I understand your position, she said. And I'm not asking you to violate anyone's confidence. I'm asking you to tell me whether my father has already been contacted, so that my telegram to him can be appropriately contextualized. She met his eyes. I'm going to send it regardless. I just need to know whether I'm sending the first communication or a response. Haskell looked at the counter, looked at her, made a decision that he appeared to make for his own reasons. The Halstead office sent one at 7 this morning, he said. Adelaide nodded. Thank you. She wrote her message on the form. It was longer than a standard telegram she paid for the length without comment. It was the financial analysis version of events, the same structure she'd used in the letter, but compressed into the form her father would find most credible: specific figures, specific dates, specific documents, the legal argument in 2 sentences, and 1 sentence at the end that was not financial at all. That sentence said, I am not confused, Father. I am certain. She passed the form to Haskell and paid and walked back out into the afternoon. Victor found her an hour later. She was at the Burroughs place, working through the debt figures again at the kitchen table, when Roy came to the door and said, with the specific economy of a man who finds drama wasteful, Victor's here. Adelaide put down her pencil. She took a breath. She went to the door. Victor was in the yard. He had not dismounted, which was a choice. Staying on horseback kept him elevated, kept the conversation on his terms spatially, communicated something about how long he intended to stay. He was still in his ball clothes from the night before, which told her he'd had a worse night than he was showing. Adelaide, he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him more than it usually did. I'd like to speak with you. Go ahead, she said. He glanced at Roy, who was standing in the doorway behind her. Privately. Roy's staying, Adelaide said. It wasn't a negotiation. Victor accepted this with a jaw movement. What you did last night, he said. The accusations, they're not going to end the way you think they will. You've taken private correspondence and misrepresented it in a public setting. You've damaged the reputation of a bank that this entire community depends on. You've caused harm to... I read the letters accurately, Adelaide said. If the representation was damaging, the content of the letters was the cause. You don't understand what you read, Victor said. Exploratory business discussions. 14 months ago, Adelaide said. Named properties, named families. Agreed prices. Business projections, Victor said. Banks model potential acquisitions. Standard practice. Is it standard practice to deny extensions to the families named in those projections? Adelaide said. Is it standard to give them 30 days' notice when their contracts specify 60? Victor's horse shifted. He steadied it with an automatic movement that didn't touch his expression. The notice discrepancy was a clerical error, he said. It will be corrected. Thank you, Adelaide said. In writing, please. Dated, signed, witnessed. Something flickered across Victor's face. You've been coached, he said, and his voice had moved to something that was colder than she'd heard from him, something that had stopped trying to be pleasant. You came here and you let a ranch hand talk you in time. Silas Mercer rode to 7 ranching settlements in 9 days and collected commitments from people who don't have any financial interest in your family's business, Adelaide said. I rode into your father's house in my best dress and read the documents that proved what I suspected. She looked at him steadily. Neither of us was coached. We both just did what we're actually good at. Victor looked at her for a long moment. In that moment, she could see the man he might have been, in a different set of circumstances, genuinely intelligent, capable of real effort, not without something that might have been integrity if it had ever been required of him. He had just never needed it. He had grown up in a world that moved around him the way it moved around his father, and the moving had become invisible to him, which was the most honest thing she could say about Victor Halstead. "My father will not honor that review announcement," Victor said. "You should know that." "I know," Adelaide said. "And Cutler Minus is reviewing the documents," Adelaide said. "Whatever he finds, he finds." Victor looked at Roy. Roy looked back at Victor with the patient, weathered expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a conversation like this one and is not going to rush it. "You're making enemies," Victor said. He said it to Adelaide, but it was meant for Roy, too. "I had an engagement to a Halstead," Adelaide said. "I was already out of alternatives." Victor turned his horse. He rode out of the Burrows' yard without another word, which was, Adelaide had come to understand, how Victor ended conversations he couldn't win, not with anger but with the removal of his presence, as though his presence were itself a resource being withdrawn. Roy said, from behind her, he'll go to his father. "Yes," Adelaide said. "Horace will make a decision tonight about whether to proceed or retreat." "Yes. Which way does he go?" Adelaide thought about Horace's face at the ball, about the calculation she'd watched him make when the room's witness became apparent, about the specific type of powerful man who has survived by knowing when the cost of pressing exceeds the cost of adjusting. "He retreats on the foreclosures," she said. Far enough to say he was always going to review. "He can't afford Cutler getting those letters into a legal proceeding." She paused. "But he'll find another way to come at us." "Not the same way. Something that takes longer to see." Roy nodded. "That's what I figured," he said. They went back inside. Adelaide picked up her pencil. The work was not finished. The cooperative structure still needed to be formalized. Cutler still needed to respond. The forward contracts still needed to be converted from letters of intent to legal agreements. There were weeks of difficult things ahead, and the outcome was not guaranteed, and she knew it. But the architecture of it held. She could see it the way she could see a financial structure, not the finished building, but the load-bearing logic that determined what the finished building could be. 3 days later, Edmund Pembroke arrived on the afternoon train. Adelaide knew he was coming. She'd gotten a reply telegram that said only, "Arriving Thursday. Do not make any further public statements until I arrive," which was her father's version of both alarm and, she suspected, something complicated underneath it. She met him at the platform. He was exactly as he always was, traveling suit immaculate, posture carrying the authority of a man who believed that most situations could be resolved if the right person applied sufficient rationality to them. He was 62 years old and had been running significant amounts of money for 30 years, and he looked at his daughter on the platform of a Wyoming train station in borrowed clothes with the expression of a man whose model of events had been a substantially revised and who was working on the replacement model in real time. "You look well," he said, which was not the opening she'd expected. "I am well," she said. He studied her for a moment. "The Halstead telegram said you'd been manipulated by a ranch hand into destroying your own future." "Yes," Adelaide said. "I expected they'd say that." "The telegram you sent said you found documentary evidence of a fraudulent acquisition scheme." "Yes." "Those are," Edmund said, with the precise understatement of a man who was very good at precision, "substantially different descriptions of the same situation." "One of them is accurate," Adelaide said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he rarely had, not as a piece of his household or a variable in his plans, but with the specific attention of a man who is trying to see something clearly. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She sat him down in the Burrows' parlor. Roy and Celia had disappeared with the tact of people who understood that some conversations needed to happen without witnesses, and she laid out everything. The documents, the transcriptions, the timeline, the fee structures that weren't in the original contracts, the 60-day clause, the letters of intent, the cooperative proposal. She presented it the way she would have presented it to a difficult business associate, without apology, without drama, with the figures in front of him, and the logic laid out in sequence. Edmund Pembroke said nothing throughout. He read. He asked one question about the per-acre figure in the Garfield letter, which she answered from memory, and he made a note on the paper Roy had provided without being asked, and he kept reading. When he finished, he set the documents down. "Adelaide," he said. "Father," he stopped. Started again. "The fee structures alone represent a material misrepresentation of the loan terms. Cutler confirms the contractual basis. The bank has exposure that goes considerably beyond these 3 families." He looked at the papers. I committed capital to a Halstead partnership based on representations about how this institution was run. I know, Adelaide said. Those representations appear to have been inaccurate, Adelaide said. To say the least, Edmund was quiet. He had a particular kind of stillness when he was thinking, not physical stillness, but the stillness of someone who has temporarily redirected all available resources toward a single problem and paused everything else. The ranch hand, he said. Silas Mercer. Victor says, I know what Victor says, Adelaide said. Silas rode to 7 settlements in 9 days to collect those commitments. She met her father's eyes. He's the reason we have an alternative to Halstead that these families can actually use. Nobody coached him into that. Edmund looked at her. The look lasted longer than most of Edmund Pembroke's looks. He has feelings for you, he said. That's separate, Adelaide said. Is it? The work is real regardless of his feelings, Adelaide said. Or mine. Edmund absorbed this. He picked up the Garfield letter, her transcription of it, and read it again. I'm not going to reinstate your engagement, he said. Adelaide blinked. What? I came here prepared to require it, he said. Victor's telegram was persuasive. Certain framing. He set the letter down. But a woman who can walk into Horace Halstead's house and find this, he tapped the page, and then construct a legal alternative in 9 days while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. He paused. That is not a woman who was manipulated. That is a woman who understood the situation better than the men who created it. Adelaide sat very still. I should have asked you, Edmund said. The words came out with the specific difficulty of words that have been waiting a long time and do not travel easily before the arrangement. Whether it was what you wanted. He looked at the table. I didn't. No, Adelaide said. I was wrong to not ask. The sentence sat there. It was 4 words. It was also the first time in Adelaide's memory that her father had said a version of that sentence about anything. I know why you didn't, she said. It seemed important to say. I know you thought you were protecting me. I was protecting a plan, Edmund said, with the precision of a man who has decided to be accurate. I was protecting a financial and social arrangement that seemed sound. He paused. You were incidental to it, which is not the same as protected. He looked up. That was my failure. Adelaide looked at her hands, at the finger where the ring had been. You weren't entirely wrong about me needing something, she said honestly. I did need somewhere to go. I'd spent enough time being managed that I wasn't sure I could make my own decisions. She paused. It turns out I can, but I didn't know that when I arrived here. You know it now, Edmund said. I know it now. He looked at the documents for another long moment. Then he straightened, which was his version of closing one chapter and opening the next. I'm going to call on Horace Halstead this afternoon, he said, as his former business partner. I'm going to tell him that the partnership discussions are concluded, that I will not be proceeding with any capital commitment to his institution, and that my legal counsel will be reviewing the terms of our preliminary agreement. He paused. And I'm going to tell him that my daughter is the reason I found out, and that this reflects significantly better on her judgment than on his. Adelaide absorbed this. He won't like that, she said. No, Edmund said, he won't. He picked up his hat, which he'd set on the table when he arrived. I imagine he'll like Cutler's letter less. Cutler's letter arrived the following Monday. It confirmed everything. The 60-day clause was binding. The unauthorized fee structures constituted a material breach of the original loan agreements. The Garfield correspondence, while not criminal on its face, was sufficient grounds for a civil action regarding the coordinated denial of extensions, and Cutler recommended that the 3 families file immediately to establish their timeline. He also included a note for Adelaide personally, which said, Your analysis of the contract clause was accurate. You have a good eye for this work. If you decide to formalize that, I know several attorneys who would find your skills useful. She read that sentence twice. Then she folded the letter and filed it and went back to work, because there was still a substantial amount of it to do. Horace announced the Monday review as promised, and granted extensions to all 3 families. The extensions were real, not generous, but real, with terms that reflected the legitimate debt and not the manufactured one. The unauthorized fees were removed from the principal balances. The foreclosure proceedings were quietly withdrawn. Garfield's deal collapsed without the properties. Victor said nothing publicly about any of it. He managed the situation the way he managed everything with the controlled surface that had served him for 28 years, and he was present at the bank and correct in his professional dealings, and entirely silent on the subject of Adelaide Pembroke. The town watched all of it. This was the nature of small towns. They watched everything, remembered it, and eventually folded it into the ongoing story they told themselves about who they were. Red Willow was going to be telling the story of the Founders' Ball for a long time, and as the weeks passed, the version that stuck was not the one Victor had tried to seed the manipulated girl, the scheming cowhand, but the more interesting and accurate one, which was the one where the furniture turned out to have opinions, and those opinions turned out to be correct. Silas said nothing about the situation publicly. He went back to Broken Spur, worked with Pat Dolan's horses, and did the same things he'd always done. But on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the ball, he appeared at the Burrows' yard and asked Adelaide, without preamble, if she'd eaten breakfast. She said she hadn't. He said there was a diner on the south end of Main Street that Maribel had recommended. Adelaide put on Celia's borrowed hat and walked with him to the diner, and they sat across from each other at a small table and ordered eggs and bad coffee, and talked for an hour about the cooperative structure and the progress of the Cutler filings, and whether Pat Dolan's spring foal crop looked promising. Then they talked about other things. Then they sat for a while without talking, which was comfortable in the specific way that only a particular kind of comfort between particular kinds of people produces. On the walk back, Silas said, "I put down payment on a parcel of land." Adelaide stopped walking. "When?" "Week ago," he said. "Neglected piece backs up to Broken Spur's east fence. Good water access, needs work on the outbuildings." He kept walking. 5 years of savings. Adelaide resumed walking. "You never mentioned it." "Didn't know how it was going to go," he said. "Didn't want to," he paused. "Didn't want to present it like I was trying to impress you, or like I was counting on something. But you bought it anyway," she said. "I've wanted land since I was 19 years old," Silas said. "That's not about you. That's about me." He glanced at her. "But I'll admit the timing had some of you in it." Adelaide walked for a moment. "How much work do the outbuildings need?" "Significant amount," he said. "Roof on the main structure is questionable. Fencing needs replacing on 2 sides. There's a corral that's been left to deteriorate." He paused. "It's not a finished thing. It's a beginning of a thing." "Beginnings are fine," Adelaide said. He looked at her sideways. "That looked the full one." "Adelaide." "Silas." "I'm not going to say something I'll need to walk back," he said. "So I'll just say whatever comes next for you. Whatever you decide to build here or elsewhere, I'd like to be in the vicinity of it." She thought about a horse in a water trough, about a laugh that had come from somewhere she'd forgotten she had, about a man who left the reins in her hand and waited. "The vicinity sounds reasonable," she said. He nodded once, satisfied with the precision of the arrangement. They walked back to the Burrows' yard in the morning light, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. The vicinity, it turned out, was a complicated place to occupy. Not between Adelaide and Silas, that part had its own quiet momentum, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply accumulates, the way water finds its level, without making a decision about it. What was complicated was everything surrounding them. Town, the bank, the slow grinding work of turning 3 families' crisis into something with a future. The fact that Red Willow was small enough that every relationship in it touched every other relationship, and what Adelaide had done at the Founders' Ball had rearranged the entire map. She understood this better as the weeks passed. A small town doesn't absorb a public rupture and simply return to its prior shape. It reorganizes around the new fact, and the reorganization takes time and isn't clean. And in the middle of it, there are people who are uncertain which way to position themselves, and who express that uncertainty by being careful around everyone involved until they figure it out. Victor was still in Red Willow. This was the thing Adelaide had not fully planned for, not his continued presence, which she'd expected, but the specific daily reality of it. They passed each other on the main street. They were in the same room at the post office twice. She saw him once across the dining room of the hotel where she no longer stayed, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read clearly, not hatred, not grief, something more complicated and more honest than either of those. Something that belonged to a man who had built his life around a particular set of certainties and was navigating their revision without a map. She didn't hate him. She had thought she might, and discovered she didn't. What she felt was something closer to clarity, the understanding of what he was and wasn't, shorn of the distortion that had come from being inside the arrangement and trying to make it work. He was a man who had been given everything he needed to see the world accurately and had chosen not to, because not seeing clearly was more comfortable than the alternative. That was a failure of will, not character, which made it both more forgivable and more disappointing than cruelty would have been. She did not say any of this to him. They moved around each other in Red Willow, with the careful navigation of two people who share a small geography and a large history, and have decided, without discussion, that the best available arrangement is a kind of functional distance. Horace was harder. Horace Halstead did not do careful distance. He did cold precision, which was different the precise withdrawal of influence. Quiet signals sent through the community's social architecture that Horace Halstead's estimation of certain people had changed, and that this change had implications. He didn't say anything publicly. He didn't need to. The message traveled through the network of obligations and relationships that he'd spent 20 years building. And it arrived in small ways: a merchant who was suddenly less forthcoming with credit terms, a civic committee that somehow forgot to include certain names on its correspondence list. Adelaide noticed it. She cataloged it with the same attention she'd brought to everything else, and then made a decision about it, which was that she could either let it constrain her, or she could build something that made the constraint irrelevant. She chose building. The cooperative lending office was Maribel's idea. Originally, or rather, it was the shape of an idea Maribel had been turning over for years, waiting for the right conjunction of people and circumstances to make it viable. When Adelaide sat in the back of the shop one afternoon in early summer and said, out loud, that what the three ranching families actually needed was not just a one-time refinancing, but ongoing access to fair credit terms from an institution that wasn't trying to acquire their land, Maribel had set down her sewing and said, yes, that is exactly what they need. Now say the next part. The next part requires capital, Adelaide said. Your father has capital, Maribel said. My father is not going to. Your father, Maribel said, came to Red Willow, reviewed your work, and told Horace Halstead that his daughter had better judgment than the men who tried to control her. She picked up her sewing again. I think you're underestimating what your father is now willing to consider. Adelaide thought about that for 2 days before she wrote the letter. When she wrote it as a business proposal, not as a daughter asking a favor, but as a person presenting a viable financial structure to a person who understood viable financial structures. She laid out the cooperative lending model, the existing relationships with the ranching families and the neighboring territory buyers, the legal framework Cutler had already established, and the projected returns on a modest initial capital commitment over a 5-year period. She included one paragraph that was not financial. It said, "This is the work I'm actually good at. Not the work you planned for me, but the work I discovered by accident while surviving the plan. I'd like to make it into something real." Adelaide Pembroke wrote back in 10 days. The letter was 3 pages long, detailed, pointed, containing several observations about her cost projections that she had to admit were accurate. And at the end of the 3rd page, after all the analysis and all the conditions and all of Edmund's very specific requirements regarding quarterly reporting and governance structure, he said, "Initial capital, as discussed. Consider this a partnership. The terms are in the attachment." Adelaide read the attachment twice. She took it to Cutler on his next circuit through Red Willow. Cutler reviewed it, suggested 2 modifications to the governance language, and told her the structure was sound. The Red Willow Cooperative Lending Association opened its doors on the 1st of September. 1886, operating out of 2 rooms above Maribel's shop because the rent was fair, and the landlady was an ally, and the location was, deliberately, not on the same end of Main Street as Halstead Bank. On the first day, 4 families came to discuss their situations. On the second day, 7. Horace Halstead, she was told by Maribel, watched the traffic with the expression of a man recalculating. The outbuildings on Silas's land needed more work than he'd initially described, which she discovered when he finally showed her the property on a Sunday morning in late August. The main structure's roof was not merely questionable, it was a philosophical statement about the impermanence of shelter, and 2 of the fence lines had given up any pretense of being barriers and had become more of a suggestion. The corral was the specific kind of deteriorated that takes decades of dedicated neglect to achieve. Silas showed her all of it without apology, which she found she preferred to a tour that managed her expectations. "You weren't exaggerating when you said it needed work," she said. I don't exaggerate, he said. The roof needs replacing, he said. I know. That's winter work. He looked at the main structure with the expression of a man who has already argued with the building's flaws and reached a provisional peace with them. The bones are good, foundation solid. Everything wrong with it is fixable. That's a reasonable way to look at a lot of things, Adelaide said. He glanced at her. I named the horse, he said, which was a change of subject that was not entirely a change of subject. Which one? The young one, from the round pen. He leaned on the fence rail. Took a while. Kept waiting to see what he turned out to be. And? Compass, Silas said. Finds his way without being told which direction. Adelaide looked at the field where the horse in question was grazing with the serene confidence of an animal that has no awareness of being named and doesn't require it. That took you 4 months, she said. Getting the right name takes as long as it takes, Silas said. Same principle applies to most things. She looked at him. He was looking at the field. He had the patience of a man who has spent years working with animals that could not be rushed and had internalized the lesson, well past the point where it was only about animals. Silas, she said. Adelaide, he said in the same tone. The question you haven't asked, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Which one? You know which one. He turned to look at her. The full look, not the brief one, not the recalibrating glance, but the real version of it that she'd catalogued the first time it appeared and had been keeping since. I didn't ask, he said, because I wanted you to be certain before I asked. And I didn't want my asking to be the thing that made you certain. I wanted it to be your own certainty. It is, she said. He studied her face for a moment, not questioning the statement, just taking the time to receive it properly. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. He didn't drop to a knee. He didn't produce a speech. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring, simple silver, with a small stone that caught the August light without making a production of it, and he held it out in his palm and let her look at it. First season's training profits, he said. Didn't want it to be anything else. She looked at it. She thought, briefly, about 31 seed pearl buttons and tissue paper folded with more care than had gone into the decision it represented. She thought about what it meant to receive a ring from a man who had not decided what came after the ring, who was simply offering the ring and trusting her to do the rest. Yes, she said. Not because the moment required more than that. Because it didn't. She took the ring from his palm and put it on herself because he hadn't moved to put it on her finger, and she liked that about him, that he gave her the ring and let her choose what to do with it. He looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. Something in his expression was very simple and very certain, which was unusual enough for Silas Mercer, who was usually maintaining some protective layer of irony, that she recognized it as significant. Don't tell me I'll get used to it, he said. I wasn't going to, she said. Good. He turned back to the property, because the roof needs deciding by October. They stood there in the August light and looked at what needed work, and what was solid, and what could be built if the right amount of stubborn patience was applied to it. And Adelaide felt, underneath the pleasure of the moment, the deeper and more durable thing, the knowledge that this was real, in the way that arrangements were not real. She had arrived at it through her own choices, and that the choices had cost her actual things, and that was precisely what made it worth keeping. The wedding was small. This was a mutual decision arrived at without particular discussion, because they were two people who had both, in their different ways, been made uncomfortable by the social performances of other people's expectations, and a large wedding was essentially a formalized version of that. Roy Burrows gave them the use of his property for the day. Maribel made Adelaide a dress practical wool in a deep blue, with buttons that numbered 4 and were located where buttons were actually useful, and said while fitting it that this was more like it, which Adelaide took as the highest available praise. Celia cried, which surprised everyone, including Celia. Roy did not cry, but shook Silas's hand for a long time and said, "You're a decent man." Silas Mercer, which from Roy was the equivalent of an elaborate speech. Edmund Pembroke came from Philadelphia. He arrived 2 days early, which was unusual for him, and spent those 2 days reviewing the cooperative's quarterly accounts with Adelaide at the kitchen table in a way that was, she gradually understood, not really about the accounts. It was about the 2 days. About being present in a way he hadn't been when he should have been, and knowing it couldn't be retrieved but could, possibly, be met going forward with something more accurate than the distance he'd maintained. On the morning of the wedding, he said to her, Before anyone else was awake, your mother would have argued with every decision you've made since arriving here. I know, Adelaide said. She would have been wrong, Edmund said. He said it with the specificity of a man who had thought about this and was not being reflexively generous. She argued from the position that security was the highest value available to a woman. She wasn't stupid. She just couldn't imagine that the thing she most wanted to protect you from was the thing you most needed. What was that? Adelaide asked. Smallness, Edmund said. He looked at his coffee cup. She was afraid the world would make you small. She thought if she kept you very close and very managed that she could prevent it. He paused. Instead, she made the box smaller, Adelaide said. Yes. He looked up. I did the same. Yes, she said. I'm not going to say, I know, she said. You don't have to. He nodded. They drank their coffee in the early morning quiet of the Burrows' kitchen. And it was not a perfect reconciliation because those do not exist. But it was an honest one, which is the only kind worth having. Mercer Ranch, as it came to be known, took 3 years to build into something that looked like what it was going to be. The roof was replaced the first winter, the fencing the following spring. The corral was rebuilt over a summer when Silas and Roy Burrows and Pat Dolan worked 3 Saturdays together on it. And Celia brought food and Adelaide kept the accounts, and nobody made a formal occasion of it because it didn't need to be one. Silas's reputation as a horse trainer spread the way genuine reputations spread not through announcement but through results. People who brought him difficult animals went home with horses they could work with, and then they told other people. By the 3rd year, he was turning away work, which was a position he'd never imagined occupying, and that he occupied with the slight bewilderment of a man who had planned meticulously for a goal and was now surprised to have reached it. You could hire someone, Adelaide said, reviewing the season's accounts one evening at the kitchen table. I know, he said. You don't want to. I want to do the work myself, he said. I know that's not from a business standpoint. From a business standpoint, it's a valid choice to prioritize quality over scale, Adelaide said. From a personal standpoint, it's because you don't trust anyone else to do it the way you do. Both of those things, he said without apology. Both of those things, she agreed. She didn't push it. She'd learned, over 3 years, when to push and when to let a thing sit, and this was a thing that sat correctly. His insistence on doing the work himself was not stubbornness in the destructive sense, but in the sense of a man who had a standard and intended to maintain it, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered. The cooperative lending office moved to its own building in the 2nd year, a small storefront on a street that was neither Halstead's end of town nor the opposite end, but somewhere usefully in the middle. Adelaide hired a young woman named Frances Glover, the daughter of a farming family in the Eastern Territory, who had a facility for numbers and a directness of manner that Adelaide recognized as a quality in need of cultivation rather than suppression. Frances learned quickly and asked good questions and occasionally caught errors in Adelaide's own calculations, which Adelaide considered a sign of genuine competence and said so. Most people wouldn't want to hear that, Frances said, the first time she flagged a discrepancy. Most people are wasting a good employee, Adelaide said. By the end of the 2nd year, the cooperative had 43 member families. By the end of the 3rd, 61. The structure held the governance Cutler had helped formalize, the reporting Edmund's partnership required, the careful distinction between loans made on genuine assessment of viability versus loans made on the theory that default would be profitable. It was not always easy, and the decisions were not always right. And there were 2 families whose situations did not improve despite the cooperative's efforts, which Adelaide sat with, and did not dismiss, and did not pretend were failures of anything other than the genuine difficulty of farming in a territory that punished bad seasons without mercy. She wrote to Cutler about those cases. He wrote back with legal observations, and one personal observation, which was that the willingness to sit with the cases that didn't resolve cleanly was the difference between a person who was doing the work and a person who was performing it. Folded that letter and kept it. Horace Halstead's influence contracted. Not dramatically, the man had 20 years of relationships, and he was not without genuine ability but steadily, in the way that happens when an institution stops being the only option. When people had somewhere else to go, some of them went there, and the ones who stayed with Halstead stayed because of genuine loyalty or inertia, both of which were their right. The bank did not collapse. Horace did not leave Red Willow. What happened was more ordinary, and in some ways more complete than a dramatic ending, He became one institution among two in a community that had previously had only one, and the adjustment of that reality into the town's understanding of itself was gradual and permanent. Victor left in the spring of the second year. He took a position with a banking house in Denver, which was a larger city with a larger pond, and he left without a farewell that Adelaide witnessed and without any particular drama. She heard about it from Maribel, who heard it from Mrs. Finch, who was still keeping Horace's household with the efficient political awareness that had served her for a decade. Adelaide thought about Victor's departure for a day or two. She thought about the version of events in which he'd been a different kind of man, in which his intelligence and capability had been directed towards something more honest than managing people into arrangements they hadn't chosen. It was not an impossible version. He was not at his core an irredeemable person. He was a person who had been raised in a world that rewarded a certain kind of blindness and had never encountered enough friction to see through it. She hoped Denver provided some. She didn't think about him much after that. What she thought about, in the ongoing rather than the episodic sense, were the things that had turned out to matter more than she'd expected. She thought about Roy Burroughs' tin box under the floorboard and what it meant that a man had kept meticulous records for 20 years against a day he hoped would never come. She thought about what it meant that he'd been right to keep them. She thought about the difference between the security she'd arrived in Red Willow, looking for the kind that came from being inside the right arrangement, attached to the right name, and the kind she'd found, which was less comfortable and less predictable, and built on the much less elegant foundation of knowing what she was actually capable of and having proved it. The second kind was harder. It required things of her continuously. It required her to be accurate about what she was doing and why, to notice when she was taking shortcuts, to maintain a standard that had no external enforcer except herself. It did not come with the particular relief of having someone else responsible for your outcomes. What it came with instead was the knowledge that the outcomes were genuinely hers, the failures equally with the successes, which was not comfortable, but which was at least honest. She had decided, somewhere in the third year, that honest discomfort was worth considerably more than comfortable distortion. Silas said something once that she kept returning to, in the way you return to things that arrive simply and stay complicated. They'd been working on the books for the Cooperative, a quarterly review, that was running late, because the spring's foaling season hasn't taken his full attention for 2 weeks, and both of them were tired, and he'd said, without preamble, "You're better at this than anyone I've ever known." She'd been about to say something, deflecting something polite, that moved the compliment along. Instead, she heard herself say, "I know." He looked at her. "I know," she said again. "I've known it for a while. I didn't used to be able to say it without," she paused, "without qualifying it, or turning it into a joke. Or wondering whether saying it would make someone uncomfortable." "Does it?" he said. "Saying it now, yeah." She thought about it. "No," she said, "not with you." He nodded, went back to the figures. That was Silas. He didn't make a ceremony out of things that didn't need one. But she felt the acknowledgement of the moment in the ordinary way he received it, as though a woman, knowing her own capability, were a simple and obvious thing that required no particular management. And she thought that this, the unadorned normalcy of being seen clearly by someone who was not threatened by what they saw, was among the most quietly radical things that had happened to her since she'd come to Wyoming. The morning she returned to the muddy street happened on a Tuesday, more than a year into their marriage, and it was Silas who walked her there without telling her where they were going until they arrived. It was a different time of day than the first time, morning rather than afternoon, the light different, the street in its ordinary Tuesday configuration rather than the particular chaos of the livery's afternoon activity. The water trough was still there. It was the same one. She was fairly certain, the same battered wood, the same iron brackets. "Here," Silas said. Adelaide looked at the street, at the trough. "Here," she said. "This is where I fell for you," Silas said. He said it without ceremony, the way he said things he'd already decided were true. Not because you were beautiful. Not because of anything particular about who you were. He looked at the trough, because you laughed. Really laughed. The kind that you can't stop and you're not sure where it came from. He paused. "I'd been watching you for 10 days by then, because Red Willow was watching you and I was too, and you were correct. All the time. Every conversation, every supper, every visit. Correct." He looked at her. "And then the horse went into the trough, and for about 15 seconds you forgot to be correct. And you were just yourself. Whoever that was. He paused. I wanted to know whoever that was. Adelaide stood in the morning light on the muddy street and looked at the water trough and felt, at some depth below the ordinary surface of a Tuesday, the thing that was true about all of it, not the romance of it, which was real, but not the whole story, but the larger and more important truth underneath. That the laugh had mattered because it had come from somewhere she'd stopped being able to find. That she'd been so thoroughly managed into correctness that she had lost reliable access to her own responses to the part of herself that found things funny, or wrong, or worth fighting about, or worth building. That the laugh had been a signal. That she had been lucky enough, in that specific moment, to have someone who recognized what the signal meant even before she did. I was so frightened by it, she said, the laughing. It sounds, I know how that sounds. But I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that, and I couldn't remember when I'd stopped. And not being able to remember was the frightening part. I know, Silas said. I thought I was being practical, she said. The engagement, the arrangement, all of it. I thought I was being realistic about how the world worked. She looked at the trough. I didn't understand that the practicality was the thing eating me. You understood faster than you think, Silas said. You were back at the livery the next day. I told myself it was about renting a horse. It wasn't about renting a horse, he said. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He reached into his coat pocket. She recognized the gesture. It was the same gesture as the August morning at the property, the same economy of movement, the same absence of ceremony. He took out a ring, not the one he'd given her on the property, but a different one, which confused her for a moment, until she looked at it properly. It was a small ring in the same simple style, with a stone that matched the one she was wearing. I had it made, he said, from the second season's profits. Figured the first ring was the question. He held it out. This one's the answer I've been collecting. Adelaide looked at it. She was aware that her face was doing something she hadn't told it to do, which was the same condition she'd been in on this street the first time. And she found she didn't mind. Silas, she said. You can say it's unnecessary, he said. The ring you have is fine. I know that. I wasn't going to say that, she said. Took it from Hem's palm, the same way she'd taken the first one herself. Her own hands, her own choice. She put it on the same finger next to the first and looked at both of them in the morning light. First ring was the question, she said. Second is the answer, he said. What's the answer? She asked. He looked at her steadily. That it's going to keep being worth it, he said. Whatever it costs. The work, the difficulty, the all of it. Going to keep being worth doing. He paused. With you specifically. She stood there for a moment, with 2 rings on her hand on a muddy street in Wyoming, and thought about what she'd been trying to say to herself. Through all of it, through the study and the tin box, and the founder's ball, and the telegram and her father across a kitchen table at dawn. The thread that ran through all of it that she hadn't quite named. That security was not a thing you received. It was a thing you built, and you could only build it out of materials that were actually yours, your own work. Your own judgment, your own willingness to see clearly even when clear seeing was expensive. That the version she'd been offered in Philadelphia, and again at the train platform, and again in Victor's parlors, had looked like security, but was something else, a kind of comfortable suspension, where other people held the weight, and you never. Had to discover whether you could hold it yourself. That discovering you could hold your own weight was not comfortable, and was not guaranteed to look respectable, and was not the version of things her mother had tried to give her. But it was real, and real was the only thing that in the end held up. She thought about the 53 families who'd brought their situations to the cooperative and left with something more workable. About Roy Burroughs' daughter, who'd come home from school in Laramie to a working ranch and had started training as a bookkeeper with Adelaide the following spring, and who had, it turned out, a better eye for discrepancy detection than anyone Adelaide had worked with. About Pat Dolan's face on the morning after the ball, when he'd understood his daughter would have a ranch to come home to. About Maribel, who had said eyes open like it was both a warning and an invitation, and who turned out to have meant it as neither who had simply meant, this is what the world actually looks like. And you can either see it, or you can be managed by the version other people show you. About a horse that had walked directly into a water trough with complete intention and stood there looking at nothing in particular, perfectly satisfied. About a laugh that came from somewhere she'd forgotten she had. Some people arrived at themselves early. They knew from childhood what they were built for, and they simply pursued it. Adelaide was not one of those people, and she had stopped being embarrassed about that. She had arrived at herself at 24, on a train platform in Wyoming, in an expensive dress with too many buttons, in the middle of an arrangement she hadn't chosen, through a series of decisions that got harder before they got better. The route was not scenic. Several parts of it were humiliating. She had made errors in judgment and had been frightened more often than she'd shown and had stood in more than one doorway, not entirely sure which way to go. She had gone through anyway. This was, she had come to believe, what being yourself actually consisted of, not some complete and confident identity that arrived ready-made, but the ongoing practice of choosing yourself over and over in the various moments when choosing otherwise would have been easier. It was not a thing you achieved and then possessed. It was a thing you kept doing, imperfectly, on muddy Tuesday mornings, and in difficult quarterly reviews, and in the small daily negotiations of a life shared with another person who was also imperfect and also trying. Silas was watching her, which he did with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he cared about present, without pressure, patient without passivity. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That the horse had the right idea," she said. He looked at the trough. "Standing in it? Knowing what it wanted and going directly there," she said. Without apology, he was quiet for a moment. "The horse got me soaked." "You said it was a draw," Adelaide said. "It was," he said. "Horse got its trough. He looked at her. "I got whatever this is." "Whatever this is," Adelaide said. "Yeah," he held out his hand. Not to lead her anywhere specific, just open, available, waiting for her to decide what she wanted to do with it. Took it. They walked back through Red Willow on a Tuesday morning, through the town that had watched everything and remembered it and was folding it, slowly, into the ongoing story of who it was and who had lived in it. The cooperative sign was visible from the main street. Roy Burroughs' property was 6 miles east. Maribel's shop was 2 blocks south, lamp on. Needle moving, the persistent small engine of a woman who had seen clearly for a long time and waited patiently for the people around her to catch up. The world did not reform entirely. Horace Olstead did not become a generous man. The territory did not suddenly become fair to the people who worked hardest in it. Bad seasons came and would keep coming, and the cooperative could buffer them but could not eliminate them. And there would always be families for whom the math didn't resolve despite everyone's best efforts. These were true things, and Adelaide did not pretend otherwise. But the families on the eastern ranches kept their land. Pat Dolan's daughter came home to a working property and stayed. Roy Burroughs rebuilt his fence lines and eventually bought the adjacent parcel he'd been eyeing for a decade. Caleb Cheney's oldest son started an apprenticeship in the spring of the 3rd year that would, eventually, lead him into land surveying, which was work that required both precision and an honest eye, and which Caleb said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had held on when holding on was hard, suited the boy exactly. And Adelaide Pembroke, who had arrived in Red Willow on a late train in an ivory dress, carrying someone else's future, and had left the station platform with the dawning suspicion that the world, and more specific than the version she'd been handed Adelaide. Pembroke, who was now Adelaide Mercer, and kept both names because both were hers, and she had earned them differently, and did not see why earnings should be lost, walked through the town she'd chosen on a Tuesday morning with 2 rings on her hand and work, waiting in a husband whose hand she was holding, and the settled, unspectacular, completely genuine knowledge that this was what it felt like when you finally arrived somewhere that actually belonged to you. Not given, not arranged, built, her own.